Welcome to the Sherdog Radio Network preview for UFC on ESPN 47, Vettori versus Cannonier, also known as UFC Vegas 75. I'm your host, Ben Duffy of Sherdog.com. With me, once again, is Mr. Devin Tejada, the newest addition to the Sherdog Radio Network, stepping in for Keith Schillen on short notice. We appreciate you stepping up on short notice. How are you doing today, Dev?
I'm doing well, man. First off, happy to be part of the team. I appreciate you for helping me get on here. And I'm glad to fill in short notice. Ready to get this card started. I'm pretty excited coming off of a pretty eventful pay-per-view.
Very eventful pay-per-view. Obviously, we were treated to the indelible image of Amanda Nunes laying down not just her gloves, but two belts in the middle of the octagon. Like, I actually got a little emotional seeing it. And if I go down that rabbit hole, I will talk about Amanda Nunes for the next hour instead of this card, because this card is some struggle. So let's not go there. One thing I do want to get out of the way before we dig into the card. Last time you subbed for a Schillen and Duffy preview, Keith was ill. This time, Keith is tied up by work obligations that came up over the weekend. Those who are paying attention to the show might know that Keith is a police officer in Rhode Island, and specifically he is in the major crimes unit, which is the de facto homicide unit for his town, not a huge town. And there were multiple homicides over the weekend. This has got to stop. Rhode Island is already the smallest state in terms of land area. It's trying to become the smallest in terms of population, apparently. I know that Bernie Sanders is from Vermont and Keith is from Rhode Island, but in my best Bernie Sanders impression, I am once again asking you, please, to stop fucking shooting each other, Rhode Island people. Just had to get that off my chest.
And all people in general, please.
All people in general, but I'm not Superman. I can't stop all the crimes. I just want to stop the crimes that keep Keith from being able to come and hang out with us. I'd much rather do a 3-man roundtable on purpose than, have to like hit you up like 10 hours out from something, and ask you to step up, as much as I appreciate it.
Of course. And yeah, all 4 of you guys on Rhode Island need to play nice.
Yeah. It's gonna completely depopulate that place. I was looking up some facts about Rhode Island today just to make sure I was right about it not being the lowest state in terms of population. It has like 1.1 million people. Greater Houston has 7 million. Like Houston proper, like just what's within the city limits is like almost 3 million. It's hard for me to imagine my whole state having like 5 counties and a million people. Anyway, that's how much I want to talk about UFC Vegas 75. It is a 14-fight card. It is headlined by Marvin Vettori and Jared Cannonier. Obviously, you've looked up and down this bill. You've done some prep for this show. What letter grade would you give this card in advance? Obviously, grading it on the free card scale, not the pay-per-view card scale. Like, what'd you give this one?
If somebody would just fight Arman Tsarukyan, like I would automatically give this like at least a half a point up. So if it was a minus, I would bump that to a plus. So I'm gonna say C plus. But if they could get Arman Tsarukyan a real opponent, no offense, B minus.
Makes sense. It seems like Tsarukyan is a guy that has been held back to a certain extent. By his own withdrawals from fights, but also because of the UFC's difficulty in just putting him on a proper track towards contention. I totally agree there. In terms of the main event, it's an interesting matchup between 2 very good fighters, but I'll tell you this. When Israel Adesanya knocked out Alex Pereira a couple months ago to win back his title, presumably the person in the world who was most unhappy about that would have been Alex Pereira. But number 2 and 3 were probably Marvin Vettori and Jared Cannonier, with maybe Robert Whittaker sneaking in there somewhere, because this fight goes from a possible title eliminator to, you know what I mean? Like, and
you know what's crazy is if Paulo Costa actually does fight Ikram Aliskerov and Ikram goes out there and just blows his head off, he's probably closer to a title shot.
Agreed. Completely agreed. And that's what happens when you have a long-time dominant champ, one of the most dominant fighters in the sport, just putting a division on lock. Because if Alex Pereira was still your champ right now, like say he beat Izzy again, Vettori destroys Cannonier and cuts a gnarly promo, he's at the front of the line.
Totally.
We're looking at Pereira versus Vettori before the end of the year. But instead, these guys are, I mean, they're fighting for money. It's prize fighting. Somebody's going to win a prize. But other than that, it's just another fight. And this is kind of just another fight card. Having said that, I'm going to put you on the spot. Outside of the top 2 fights on the card, which fight are you most excited about? Or if you can't name one, which individual fighter are you most excited about?
It's weird because I have a weird fascination for Modestas Bukauskas only because just the way that Khalil Roundtree blew his leg up and then how he went on a winning streak outside of the UFC and looked pretty good, and then has made his way back. Anyone that can come back from an injury like that, do what he did outside of the UFC, like totally deserves another shot, especially at 205. And I know he's part of the curtain jerker, but kind of looking forward to watch him fight just to see what he can do.
I like that. Bukauskas' return has been a nice story. He's still a real young guy. I may have written him off prematurely. Seems like a real simple one, but Christian Leroy Duncan is fighting third from the top. He's still undefeated. And given the limited sample size of his UFC debut, he cautiously looks like he might be the real deal. If he can stay that exciting while beating better and better fighters, well, yeah, middleweight might not have the problem it currently has for very long. Any other general thoughts on this one before we dive into these prelims?
No, this one seems like it could be a little bit of a slog of a card, but again, just as the old saying goes, the worst cards sometimes always do the best. The worst cards on paper always come out the best, so let's hope it comes out for the best.
Sounds good. The undercard of UFC on ESPN 47 begins with a light heavyweight matchup between Zach Pauga and Modestas Bukauskas. Pauga, the 35-year-old, is 6-1 overall. He is 1-1 in the UFC since joining as the runner-up of the 30th season of The Ultimate Fighter. He, of course, competed on The Ultimate Fighter at heavyweight. He appeared at the Tough 30 final, which also went by UFC Fight Night Santos versus Hill, where he got knocked out early in the second round by season winner Muhammad Usman. He came back from that, dropped back down to 205 pounds, and took a unanimous decision over Jordan Wright in February at UFC Fight Night Andrade versus Blanchfield. Pauga will look to make it 2 in a row against Bukauskas, who says the same. The 29-year-old Lithuanian by way of England is 14-5 overall. He is 2-3 across 2 separate stints in the UFC, but he is 1-0 since returning. He left the UFC back in 2021 on 3 straight losses, went and won back his Cage Warriors light heavyweight title. He is now a 2-time Cage Warriors light heavyweight champ. That was good enough to get him back to the UFC, where he debuted at UFC 280. Returned at UFC 284, taking a unanimous decision over Tyson Pedro. So he also looking for his second UFC win in a row. He is favored to do so. Bukauskas, a moderate favorite at -170. Pauga plus 140 on the comeback. I was happy to write off Bukauskas on his way out of the UFC. I want to say I picked him to lose all 3 of his last UFC fights, and I was right all 3 times. He presents as a kickboxer, obviously, but as a 6'3" guy with long limbs from Eastern Europe, you expect more of a straightforward kickboxer, but in practice, he comes across to me more as a boxer who kicks. And, it's the same skill set, but in terms of approach, he's most comfortable with his fists as his weapons, but perfectly willing to kick, and he has hard kicks when he does, as you would expect of a guy with long legs and good fundamentals. But his problem in his first UFC run is he needed to fight at just the outer edge of boxing range and the inner edge of kicking range, like more or less an outfighter, but he didn't have the footwork to keep determined foes out of his phone booth. and he lacked the physical strength to get people off of him once they could crash the pocket. Like Jimmy Crute, that's a tough one because Jimmy Crute is a ox of a man at 205 pounds. But Michal Oleksiejczuk is a smallish light heavyweight who has since dropped to 185, and Oleksiejczuk was all over him too. Granted, I think he actually should have gotten the decision there, but the fact remains he couldn't make his game plan run against Oleksiejczuk. Then Roundtree wanted to operate in the same range and was just better at it and destroyed his leg. Since Bukauskas is back, I'm not going to put too much credence into beating Tyson Pedro. I still don't believe in Tyson Pedro as a fighter with the fight IQ to win fights, even when he is the more skilled fighter. I mean, he looked good in winning a competitive fight with a dangerous guy in Pedro, but I kind of leave it at that. What makes me more interested is that Bukauskas has transformed his physique a bit. He seems to have put on about 10 pounds of muscle. He's not kind of a spindly, bird-chested 6'3" anymore. He looks like a full-fledged UFC light heavyweight, and the eyeball test isn't everything, but against Pedro, who is explosive and very, very strong, Bukauskas was able to conduct a lot of the fight in his preferred range. That gives me hope for him against Pauga. Pauga, I never like to see a 35-year-old guy going into his 8th fight. He's a late bloomer in terms of MMA. He was a college football player. I think he may even have bounced around some like minor football leagues. I don't think he ever had any time in the NFL, but I want to say he did something like, arena football or Europe or something. But at any rate, he was a late starter in MMA. He's taken to it pretty well. He has good natural skills. He's a very good athlete, very strong, naturally explosive. And for what it's worth, for a guy with only 7 fights, he has some good component skills. He's a good wrestler. He's a pretty good striker, and pretty good at mixing the two of them, which often for newcomers to MMA is the hardest thing to master. Like it's harder to come up with the kind of mortar between the bricks. And he seems to be pretty good at that already. He was winning against Muhammad Usman. He'd been out striking him, had not been taken down. At the end of that first round of that TUF 30 final where Pauga had won the round, I was like, oh, he's got this, because I know that Muhammad Usman does not have a gas tank, but he made one mistake, just kind of overextended himself on a jab or like a lead hook or something, got out too far over his feet, and Usman blew him up. That's great for Usman. Not a great look for Pauga, but basically he was looking pretty good until he gave Usman the one chance he was going to have to win that fight. Came back against Jordan Wright, and I thought he looked good. Wright is, but it's interesting. Wright, kind of like Bukauskas, is a big, tall, light heavyweight with range and who wants to operate in that kind of range. Wright definitely, more of a karate stylist, has a different stance, but wants to operate in the same general range and is looking to snipe with single huge shots to hurt his opponent and then finish. And it can't always keep his opponent off him. I mean, there's some similarities between him and Bukauskas, and Pauga was all over him. He crowded him, he clinched, just wore on him, made him wear his weight, shoved him into the fence. It wasn't a real fun fight to watch, but he never gave Jordan Wright that Muhammad Usman moment. Because of that, I'm kind of leaning towards him here as the slight upset right off the bat. Again, as much as Bukauskas has some general similarities to Wright, Pauga also has some general similarities to Pedro. He's a big, strong, light heavyweight. But I just don't have faith that Bukauskas will be able to, at least for 2 rounds out of 3, keep Pauga off him, operate at the range he wants to. It would be more fun if he did, be a more enjoyable fight. Worth noting that Pauga's last fight before this was a co-main event. Bukauskas' last fight before this was a top prelim. And now they're fighting in the curtain jerker, and it's because both of their last fights were terrible to watch. Give me Pauga by decision here in another kind of lousy fight to watch, but I just don't think Bukauskas is going to be able to really keep Pauga on the end of his punches, circle away from the cage. I think Pauga is just going to crash the pocket, shove him into the fence, clinch, maybe take him down. I mean, Tyson Pedro took Bukauskas down pretty easily, like just kind of hoisted and tossed him. Pauga can do that. So yeah, give me Pauga by decision here.
Yeah, Pauga's fight with Jordan Wright is really hard to gain much from, because Jordan Wright was just like okay being in the clinch, because that's something he's like a place that he sort of likes to operate. And at this point, I think you're just supposed to go kill Jordan Wright. Like, I think he's that guy, and I think that's what the UFC wanted Zach Pauga to do, and he fought like the exact opposite game plan of what you're supposed to do. But again, I understand why he fought the way he did, coming off a fight that you're cruising to a victory and then just getting absolutely blasted. Yeah, it was up a division, but still. And I mean, go look at Muhammad Usman's fight with Junior Tafa, and
no, I won't.
Like, you know what I mean? Like that,
yeah.
but the way that Muhammad fought in that fight, like a guy like that shouldn't be knocking on anyone. And for Bukauskas, he did lose to Jimmy Crute, and just like his nickname, like Jimmy Crute is going to be a brute and just walk through. If you don't kill him, he's going to continue to crash the pocket and get in your face over and over again, and he's super physical. And then his loss to Khalil Roundtree, like, yeah, that was pretty tough to watch. But if you look at Khalil Roundtree, Khalil is a anomaly, because when he wants to win a fight and he wants to be a great fighter, sometimes he looks like an absolute world beater, like he could go kickbox with the champion, and then other times he looks off. This fight, he looked very pissed.
Completely agree. Khalil Roundtree is the first fighter I can remember, like the first North American fighter I can remember, who went and did a fight camp in Thailand and actually came back a better striker. Like everyone else, and killed Eric Anders. Like every other fighter up until then was like, oh yeah, I spent 6 months at Tiger Muay Thai, or AKA Phuket. They came back with a great tan and the same skill set, because it's a beautiful country. It's super cheap to stay there. And you can be like, oh yeah, I'm getting my Muay Thai going, but none of them got any better at Muay Thai except for him. But yeah, just to back up that point.
And also, Khalil came off that loss to Ion Cutelaba and Marcin Prachnio, and he, like, whenever Khalil's on a mission, like, I don't, if that dude's firing on all cylinders and he's on a mission, like, he's trouble for really anyone. And then Mikhail Olazechuk, I feel like he's definitely underrated boxing wise, but he's also super durable. So he's another one of those dudes that, even when he was at light heavyweight, he looked small at middleweight even. But when he was at light heavyweight, like, he was able to just swing and cling with people over and over again. And
swing and cling.
Like, and it's weird too, because
what a great description.
And that's what he used to, he would get in your face, hit you with some shots, put you up against the cage. And he kind of was able to do that to Bukauskas. But Bukauskas went to Cage Warriors and won a belt and defended it in impressive fashion, via knockout. Like that was great. I think, just like you said, physically he has come a long way. I think he's probably a little bit better of a striker than Pauga. And I think he might want to go for it a little bit more there. The clinch is a place that does worry me, because Pauga is big, he's strong, he's probably the better athlete of the two. I think he can push Bukauskas up against the cage. I'm going to bet Bukauskas is able to shuck him off and hit him with shots. And I think Bukauskas probably wants to be an MMA fighter more than Zach Pauga. And I think, he'll probably want to win this fight a little bit more than Pauga. I think he's going to go shuck him off and just hit him with shots and probably cruise to. I'm not going to say cruise, but, maybe drop the third round getting clinched against the cage, but wins the first two.
Next up at UFC Vegas 75, we have a bantamweight matchup between Dan Argueta and Ronnie Lawrence. Argueta, the 29-year-old New Mexico native, is 9-1 He won his last time out. It was a unanimous decision win over the short notice Nick Aguirre at UFC Fight Night Strickland versus Imavov back in January. Prior to that, he had lost a unanimous decision in his short notice debut against Damon Jackson last June. This will be the first fight of his UFC career that does not involve either him or his opponent showing up on short notice. It will also be the first fight of his UFC career where he is back at 135 pounds. He was the outgoing LFA bantamweight champ, also competed on the 29th season of The Ultimate Fighter at bantamweight, but came to the UFC, fought twice at featherweight, and now he is back in the weight class where he probably belongs. Waiting for him there will be Lawrence. The 30-year-old Tennessean is 8-2 overall. He is 2-1 since joining the UFC out of Dana White's Contender Series. He debuted in the UFC with back-to-back wins over Vince Cachero and Leomana Martinez before running into Said Yakub Kakramanov at UFC Fight Night Dos Anjos versus Fiziev last July, where he dropped a unanimous decision. So almost a year on from his last appearance, he'll be looking to get back on track. He is favored to do so. Lawrence is minus 170, Argueta plus 140. I like Dan Argueta a lot as a prospect. I didn't think we'd see him when we did. Obviously, he stepped in on short notice, up a weight class against a guy you don't want to step up on short notice, up a weight class against in Damon Jackson, because Damon Jackson is a big featherweight and he's also a durable one who never gets tired. So if you're coming in on short notice, you got a guy that's bigger than you and probably in better shape. That's not a good look. And he was still pretty competitive. Then, against Aguirre, who stepped in on short notice, he held serve. I like him at 135. He's a guy that's well-rounded. Like he's a solid boxer, pushes a hard pace. He is good at wrestling and is good at mixing his wrestling and his striking. Like very good at just seamlessly going from punch combinations into level changes, good at timing level changes to his opponent's aggression. This is going to be a theme, something I mentioned about a couple of fighters on this card. When you're a well-rounded fighter, when you're pretty good at everything but not great at any one thing, your success depends a lot on being able to, and I hate pulling out the cliche, impose your will. Like if you're a 6 out of 10 as a striker, wrestler, and grappler, and your opponent is a 4, and a 9, then you're going to win if you can force the fight into the areas where you have the advantage. Argueta doesn't always do that. That's the problem. He's very aggressive. He pushes a very high pace. Like I said, he moves seamlessly between striking and grappling, but also somewhat aimlessly. And so when he runs into somebody who can either just force him into the part of the game that he wants, like Jackson was able to, or somebody who's perfectly willing to be wild but is just better at all those things than him, like Ricky Tercios on Tough, he comes up short. So the question for me is he better anywhere than Lawrence? And if so, can he actually leverage those advantages? I've underestimated Lawrence since he got to the UFC. I'm done underestimating him. I think Ronnie Lawrence is actually a pretty damn legit prospect at 135 pounds. The only drawback I see, the only problem I see is that he's already 30. He only has 10 fights under his belt, and he's in a division at 135 pounds where you have to string together a lot of wins in a row to even sniff the top 15. And it's not super kind to people who were past about the age of 32 or so. So he has a limited window of time in which to get things done. But I do like him here against Argueta. Just Lawrence, kind of like Argueta, he's a good wrestler. He's a very solid striker with good power. He switches stances constantly. I think he's a little better from orthodox. His single best punch is probably his right cross, his orthodox right cross. And like Argueta, he's good at mixing in his wrestling either to keep his opponent off balance or on the occasions he's getting something he doesn't like on the feet. I think really the best chance for Argueta to win this fight, to pull ahead, would be for Lawrence to make a mistake. And it's always tough to pick an upset when the underdog's best routes to victory involve his opponent having to make a mistake. And here, I mean, Lawrence was handling Mana Martinez pretty well last year, but made one mistake in the third round, got hurt bad, and I mean, he survived, but he shouldn't have had to survive. He should have cruised on to a 30-27 win, which hurts me to say because I love Mana, but like Lawrence was just a better fighter that night, and he left the door open. If he does that to Argueta, he can definitely drop a round, if not the fight. Like, if Argueta takes him down, he might be able to keep him down. Argueta hits hard. If Lawrence leaves himself open like that and Argueta tags him, he can definitely hurt him. But I think that's the outside chance. I expect that this should be a really fun scrap between two fighters with a lot of the same skills, but Lawrence is just a little sharper, a little more experienced against that, a higher level of competition. And even though Argueta is the one that's fought back and forth at 145 over his career, I think Lawrence is going to be the physically stronger guy when they get their hands on each other. So give me Lawrence to win a decision here in a real fun fight.
Yeah, and Argueta's also even spoke, to the media about cutting to bantamweight. He has, mentioned that it is tougher for him to do that. I know that was part of the subject he was discussing on a short notice fight with Damon Jackson. And Ronnie Lawrence did good against Mana Martinez. He did get hurt in the third round, but he also hurt Mana quite a bit in that fight too. He kind of gassed out, which is a little bit weird. He looked like that. That looks like what caused some of his defensive lapses in the third round of that fight. You have to kind of wipe away the Said Yakub Kakramanov fight because probably one of the dumbest decisions by the UFC to cut a fighter in recent history was them cutting Said Yakub. That was like utterly foolish because he's very good. And he handled Ronnie Lawrence, but I would expect Said Yakub to do the same thing to Argueta, and probably worse because Argueta would probably accept the grappling from him. I think that's what Argueta's problem really is he has been known to accept whatever fight his opponents have. And instead of being a guy that comes up with ideas and, does things to win fights, I think he's more of a reactionary guy where he's been taught to just react to what his opponents do. And yeah, you can win fights like that, but I've never seen him really press a game. Like the Ricky Turcios fight, he just had whatever, like, I'm really noticing this fight is pretty close to home for you, huh? Like these two guys have, and with Ricky Turcios, like UFC level bantamweights that want to crack the top 25 shouldn't lose fights to Ricky Turcios. As much as I hate to say that, because I like Ricky Turcios. He seems like a really cool, fun dude.
Dude,
but
I'll tell a story about him later, but yeah, go ahead.
He and Argueta just, he is big. Like if you look at him, he's one of those dudes with the huge wide back. He's a short, stocky dude. I just think it's one of those things where like anything you can do, I can do better. I think Ronnie Lawrence can strike better than him. I think he can outgrapple him. I think he's a better scrambler. And Argueta's problem seem to be that he thinks he can be a better grappler than some of those people. The Damon Jackson fight, like he was willing to scramble and grapple with a guy like that on short notice up a division. And that type of shit just worries me against a guy like Ronnie Lawrence who, may gas out, may have defensive lapses, but I also don't think striking wise Argueta is as dangerous as someone like Mana Martinez. And not too sure what his future holds in the UFC, Mana, but I definitely would say that he's probably a little more dangerous on the feet than Argueta. I also got to go with Ronnie Lawrence, probably by decision here. Banks the first two, even if he gets tired. I don't think Argueta has what it takes to put someone like him out.
We head now to the women's flyweight division for a matchup between Tereza Bleda and Gabriella Fernandez. Bleda, the 21-year-old Czech, is 6-1 overall. She is 0-1 since joining the UFC out of Dana White's Contender Series last November. She got knocked out in the third round by Natalia Silva, so she's still looking for her first win in the octagon. Well, the real octagon. She did win on the Contender Series, but she is going to run into Fernandez, who can say the same. The 29-year-old Brazilian is 8-2 overall. She is also 0-1 in the UFC. She was the outgoing LFA flyweight champ when she debuted this February against Jasmine Jasudavicius, dropping a unanimous decision. Here, Bleda is a massive favorite. She is minus 270. Fernandez plus 220 on the comeback. Keith Schillen is not here, but I'll do my best Keith Schillen impression and say Tereza Bleda should not be an almost 3-1 favorite over anybody in the UFC. Here's the good about Bleda. She is big. She is a big flyweight. She's 5'9", long arms, long legs. She's not scrawny. She's got muscle on her frame. So yeah, in terms of the eyeball test, like she brings some serious diesel to the 125-pound division. She is a judo fighter. Her nickname is Ronda. She comes from a judo background, but she is not Ronda Rousey. Her problem is she has been able to get her fights to the ground generally when she wants to. Well, definitely was able to back in Octagon MMA in the Czech Republic, which just isn't super high level, but was able to on the Contender Series, had limited success against Natalia Silva, but she basically has to bully and muscle to do it. And when I think of great judo in MMA, I think of Caro Parisian just grabbing, a collar tie and an underhook and sending some dude flying through the air, and it looks like with basically no effort on his part. Like, that's judo. It's the gentle art. You use their momentum and their weight against them. Anyone who's big and strong enough can do what Bleda has generally done in MMA. The problem is her being that big, she clearly has a substantial weight cut and she gets tired. That is her problem. She was fairly competitive against Natalia Silva going into it. Like, the first round was pretty competitive. By the end of the second round, Silva was really rolling downhill on her. And the third round, she just had nothing to offer, and Silva busted her up. Now, that loss has aged well. Silva is like 3-0 in the UFC right now. And if she's not in that 11 through 15 bubble list of the Sherdog rankings for 125, she was at least in our discussion the other week when she won her last fight. So no shame in losing to her, but the way she lost is concerning. Here against Fernandez, I like Fernandez. She's a kickboxer. She's a good kickboxer. Good snap on her kicks, good straight punches, good footwork. Even among fighters who come to MMA from a kickboxing background, it's surprising how few of them have good lateral footwork. And in almost every case, they're going from a square kickboxing ring to the UFC octagon or the round Bellator cage, where you would think it would be easier, not harder, to keep from getting marched into a corner. But look no further than Diana Belbitsa last week, where, she's a former Glory kickboxing champ, and just easiest thing for her opponents to march her into the cage. Fernandez has good footwork. She's been pretty good at sliding around the outside, giving ground, looking to counter. It's refreshing to see. She was taken down by Jasmine Jasudavicius, but especially early on, Jasudavicius only got it by being kind of a dog. Like, Fernandez would stuff the first takedown attempt, and it would be the second and third effort, like chain wrestling by Jasudavicius, that would end up getting her down. That's a good sign, because she's going from Jasudavicius to another fighter in Bleda, who also was very big for the division, very strong, and if she knows what's good for her, is going to want the fight on the ground. But where Jasudavicius is efficient with her energy, Bleda is not. the great thing for Jasdavicius against Hernandez is that she was able to chain wrestle, turn a double into a single, just, keep on chaining attempts without really wearing herself out. Whereas Bleda's second, her plan B when her first takedown idea doesn't work is just to do it again harder.
Which gets you more and more tired.
Exactly. And against Fernandes isn't small. I mean, she's not as big as Bleda, but she's not small. She's probably about 5'5", 5'6", clearly cut some weight to make the limit. And while she is not Norma Dumont, she has thick legs. Like, she has a low center of gravity. It's a huge, it's a substantial upset here, but I like Fernandes in this fight because even if I concede that Bleda is going to be able to get takedowns in the first round, do enough work on top, like chip away with strikes, maybe try some submission attempts to win that first round, I think she's going to be tired by the second. And if she starts to get tired and Fernandes isn't badly hurt or didn't take a 10-8 round in the first round or didn't get finished, I think Fernandez's footwork is going to have Bleda running in straight lines at an opponent who's moving in curves. I think she's going to be able to start chucking off the first, second, third takedown attempts and maybe start teeing off on her on the feet. Give me Fernandes here in a pretty substantial upset. I was going with a decision, but you know what? Give me Fernandes by a third round TKO of just a tired and discouraged Bleda. Gabriella Fernandez, the plus 220 underdog. I'm calling it.
Especially like in women's MMA, when a over 2-1 underdog wins a fight, like, it's usually pretty fun. Just sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's just very, like, tells you a lot about the big favorite. I think Jasmine Jasdavicius is just like a better version of Bleda. Like, they have super similar games, super similar body types. You could almost get them confused. Like, well,
except that Jasdavicius has a normal haircut and Bleda has a fucked up haircut. But aside from that, like in silhouette, yes.
Like you could almost but Jasdavicius just does everything a little bit better. She's definitely more bullish. She definitely has better cardio. And I think Jasdavicius is a little bit more of a dog. Like, she can definitely take a little bit more of a beating, especially just getting into the pocket, forcing her will. Bleda's just seems to be like a little bit of a front runner for me. I don't like to call people that, but when things are going good, they're going good. But then when things start going bad, they go bad. Natalie Silva is, a girl that didn't have the best record and then took a really long break from MMA and then just shot back onto the scene and is still in her early 20s and is one of those like different true super athletes in women's MMA. So I think Natalie Silva is going to probably have a lot more fights that look like the Bleda fight moving forward. Natalie Silva, just a sidebar, her athleticism reminds me of like a gymnast.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Just super fast, super strong, great cardio. But for Bleda, she just worries me a little bit. Her cardio is, some people can, lose their cardio and be tired, but still keep their fight IQ in check. But she's 21.
Yep. And
she seems to be one of those people that gets tired and then, also likes to make mistakes. And Fernandez is definitely, she's a little bit older. Her very first MMA win was in 2018 against Yasmin Lucindo. Like, that's a good win to start your MMA career. Like, Lucindo's probably better than Bleda.
Yeah.
That was her first MMA fight. I agree with you, and if Keith is listening to this or Keith sees these odds, he probably would agree with both of us, but I don't like the odds. Like, this should just be like a straight pick'em fight. Just two women's flyweights that are way outside of the reaches of being ranked. We'll probably find out that one of them doesn't belong in the UFC, or is maybe too early for the UFC. I agree with you about Fernandez. I think she can, just poke and stay on the outside. if this fight goes 3 rounds, regardless of what happens in the first 2, I'm going to say Fernandes probably wins the third. And then if she can, the way she wins this fight is letting Bleda grapple, not getting instant subbed. Bleda could take her down and just instant sub her. She has armbar wins. Bleda likes to push a wrestling game. She likes to push a grappling game, and she likes to try to submit. I could see that happening. But if Fernandes can not, even if she loses the first round and loses the first 2 minutes of the second round, if she can win the last 3 minutes of the second round and then win the third round, I think she could take it by a tight decision. I'm going to agree with you on the upset. I don't know if she'll win by finish. I hope she does because I think it'd be interesting. But I'm going to pick Fernandes by decision in a fight that if you got to pick up the kids or something, if you don't want to pay for DoorDash and you want to go just grab that takeout real quick, this might be the one.
I might start smoking just so I can go take a smoke break.
Newports. All dirty.
Oh yeah. Next up, the male flyweights take the cage as it is Zhalgas Zhumagulov versus Felipe Bunes. Zhumagulov, the 34-year-old from Kazakhstan, is 14-8 overall. He is 1-5 since joining the UFC as the former Fight Night Global Flyweight champ. He is on a 3-fight losing streak dating all the way back to late 2021. He fought most recently last November at UFC Fight Night Zechikwu versus Kudalaba, where he dropped a split decision to Charles Johnson. The unluckiest man in the UFC will look to get things back on track and I would say preserve his job, but apparently his job is pretty safe. Whatever. He'll look to get back in the win column against Bunes. The 33-year-old Brazilian is 13-6 overall. This will be his UFC debut. He is a former LFA flyweight champ. He fought most recently in January in the headliner of LFA 149, lamping Yuma Horiyuchi late in the first round. Odds here, they found somebody that is an underdog to the unluckiest man in the UFC, as Zhumagulov is minus 150, Bunes around plus 120 on most of your outlets. Okay, so when Zhalgas Zhumagulov was 0-1, 0-2 in the UFC, I said, this is a top 15 talent, if not top 10, who just has had some tough breaks. I mean, Raunie Paiva and Amir Albazi, in hindsight, are 2 really tough fights out of the gate. And I sort of stamped Zhumagulov as a future contender coming out of Fight Nights Global because his last couple fights there, Ali Bagatinov, former UFC title challenger, Tagir Ulanbekov, outstanding fighter, Tyson Nam, long-time solid UFC 125 and 135 pounder, and he handled them all. I said, okay, this is a guy that should slot right in and be, an instant contender in the UFC. And when he dropped a couple fights out of the gate, I said, okay, he's still a top 10 guy, just things haven't broken right yet for him. But when he went to 1-3, 1-4, 1-5, okay, I'm no longer... I'm probably the last man off the Zhalgas Zhumagulov bandwagon, but he does have some problems at the UFC level. He's a little small for a flyweight. He's not tall for a flyweight. He's like 5'4" or whatever, but doesn't have great reach and doesn't really help his reach because he doesn't really throw straight punches. He's kind of a hook machine, and he likes to push a furious pace. Like, he is a willing striker who throws a lot of volume, and his gas tank is just okay by flyweight standards. So he doesn't have that extra gear that in a close, like, he's lost a lot of close fights in the UFC, and a lot of them have been against bigger dudes like Jeff Molina and Charles Johnson and Raunie Paiva, where you would think Zhumagulov would have more left in the tank, maybe be able to find another gear late, and he really hasn't. So he's come up against his limitations. I mean, I still think he's better than 1-5 in the UFC, totally. Would seem to indicate, but he is what he is. And at 34, at the very best, he's on the tail end of his prime. He has 2 women back in Kazakhstan draining all the vital essence out of him. So he's probably aging prematurely there. He just picked up the worst haircut in the UFC. Things not looking great for Zhumagulov. Having said that, Felipe Bunes, he's a nice addition to the division, but at 33, making his debut, I feel as though, I mean, he's not a prospect.
No,
he's an international journeyman who's getting a chance in the UFC, and maybe he'll shock us like, Chris Curtis or something. But he's a 33-year-old. He's fought good fighters already. I mean, he was a former LFA champ, but before that, he got choked all the way to sleep by Jussier Formiga. And part of the problem there is that Formiga is better at the things that Bunes is good at, and part of it is that Formiga missed weight so badly that any respectable promotion or commission would not have even sanctioned the thing because it was supposed to be a flyweight fight, and Formiga showed up at like 138 pounds. But even throwing that one aside, the people he beat in LFA just aren't that great. He left, or he didn't leave ACA, but he was in Absolute Championship Akhmat, and he had a 3-fight losing streak there because they kept using him to put over their prospects. Like the 3 people he lost to in ACA, 2 of the 3 will be in the UFC a year and a half from now if they want to be. They might not want to be because they might want to just stay in embargo land and make bank off of like, Chechen war dollars. But I've seen what it looks like when Bunes fights great fighters, and it's not pretty. In terms of fight style, he's an orthodox striker. He has fast hands, decent reach for the division. Like, I expect he'll have a reach advantage over Zhumagulov, or at least an advantage in functional reach, because again, he probably throws a little bit straighter punches. For a guy who, I mean, you look at his record, he has a ton more submissions than anything else, and he definitely identifies as a grappler. He's a mean left hook. He finished Horiuchi with that. And it's fast, it's accurate, it's technical, and he caught Horiuchi with it a couple times before the one that finished the fight. He's a good submission artist, but he's a good offensive submission artist who is susceptible against better grapplers. Like Jussier Formiga took his back with ease, put him out. The Russians that he lost to over in ACA, he was a little too willing to lose rounds off his back looking for a submission or a more low percentage sweep, and just ended up losing rounds that way. If he's gonna beat Zhumagulov, he's either gonna need to nail him with that left hook, and I mean that's possible, but the only person I've seen really hurt Zhumagulov in the UFC is Manuel, and Manuel is probably the hardest hitter in the division, like, period, full stop.
And if he's not the hardest hitter, he's the one of 2 or 3 people that are capable of throwing an extremely explosive jump knee that's going to just kill you.
Right.
I don't know even who else off the top of my head is capable of that in that division.
No. Not
even the champ.
Not even the champ.
Royval, maybe. That's it.
And Royval would jump, not knowing whether he was going to throw a flying knee or try like a flying armbar. He'd just make up his mind in the air.
Bite you.
Yeah. He's stealing Pantosias. I think even if Bunes hits Zhumagulov with like a huge shot, we're going to get like a desperation takedown that works, because Zhumagulov is a pretty good offensive wrestler and Bunes is not a great defensive wrestler. Yeah, I expect that Zhumagulov is going to get right with the world, get to 2-5 in the UFC. I would say he probably wins all 3 rounds against Bunes. Just, it'll be some fun, wild stand-up exchanges while they last. I think the wrestling will be there as a safety outlet for Zhumagulov. And if his offensive wrestling is on point so that when they go to the ground, he's the guy on top, he probably doesn't have a whole lot to fear. If we end up with wild scrambles where he gets his back taken standing, or Bunes is like hitting switches while they're rolling around like Looney Tunes characters, and Bunes ends up on top, Zhumagulov could be in a little bit more trouble because Bunes is bigger and is punishing from top position. And I mean, might even try some submissions. But I feel pretty safe taking Zhumagulov here, and couldn't happen. Why? I would say couldn't happen to a nicer guy. I don't know if he's nice. I'd have to ask his wives.
You'd at least think he is non-confrontational, having 2 wives.
Oh, he needs to go straight to like an ambassador, to the United States from Kazakhstan. He clearly can keep the peace.
Yeah.
Like Alex Cowboy Oliveira getting blown up with grenades on New Year's Eve. Like, he's not the guy you want for your peacekeeper. Zhumagulov is the guy.
Yeah. And for Zhumagulov, I think one of his problems too is like modern flyweights are just getting bigger at the UFC level. And they're getting to be more athletic. Like, he's a decent athlete, but being a decent athlete, you can get away with that at middleweight.
Yeah.
But flyweight is like, this is where all the people that are actually true athletes go, because there's no other sports for them. Like, if, you're not playing stick and ball sports at 5'5".
And if you are in MMA and you're undersized like he is, there's no place there's no men's strawweight division in any respectable promotion right now. So there's no place to go.
Unless you're going to box, unless you're going to be a boxer. And that's not the case for him. Zhalgas is actually, like, he's good at MMA. Like, he's one of those dudes that's actually just like a solid kind of, nuts and bolts MMA fighter. I think he beat Charles Johnson. He hurt him multiple times, which is actually like a dude as big as Charles Johnson and as good of a boxer. Like, Zhumagulov had a lot of success on the feet. He hurt him multiple times in that fight. And it's, of course, Zhalgas lost that fight because it was a close fight. He took everything that Johnson had to give to as well, as far as, on the feet with the striking. And the only time I've ever seen him buzzed was from Manuel.
Yeah.
Like he, and I mean, if anybody runs up to you and hits you in the head with a sledgehammer, you're going to get hurt from it. And that's basically what Manuel Cap did to him. Like that, just a flash knockout. And he wasn't sleeping.
Oh,
like I've never really seen him hurt besides that. I just think that his problem is he just had a regional game, and he kind of took a regional game to the UFC, even though he beat UFC level dudes with a regional game in a regional promotion. Like, once you get to the UFC, like, you have to be able to like up your volume, but also up your power punching. And he kind of showed that last time out. And he kind of did get screwed on the scorecards. I'm pretty sure you probably agree with he actually won that fight. I do.
Yeah.
I think he did. So I'm gonna go with Zhalgas, but I'm sorry. If he loses another fight, like, I can't, like, there's just so many. If you look through his record and you go back and watch the tape, if anyone has the time to actually go watch Zhalgas Zhumagulov fights, like, you could score every single one of his split decision losses for him.
That's why I say he's the unluckiest guy.
Like, every one of them.
Yeah. And he's not one of those people that has a bunch of split decision losses where it's kind of his own fault because he could have done more, because he is doing the best he can with his skill set and his physicality.
Yeah, and like, he wasn't, like, last time out, he showed that he can power punch.
Mm-hmm.
And he still lost. Like, he made the improvement, like, he did the thing, and like, he still lost, which is like, God, man. And my question is, like, will Felipe come in and look like Ursig did last week on 8 days' notice and really show out? Or is Zhumagulov going to come out here and actually power punch with volume and hurt him? I could see that happening too. I'm going to go Zhumagulov by decision in this fight. But again, frick, man. If this dude wins another, like, split decision, I won't know what to think. And he'll probably still have his contract. If he loses via split decision, will he fight in the UFC again?
I have no idea, because I assumed he was cut after his last loss.
He retired. This is him coming back from retirement.
Thank you. That's right.
He's got so many kids, dude. 2 wives. He's got kids.
He got home, spent a week with his 2 wives, and was like, "Screw this! I'm unretiring." I see it. Yep.
Yeah. Gosh, poor fella. Hope he get. I honestly if anyone deserves a win in the UFC, it's freaking Zhalgas, man. So I really hope it happens.
Completely agree. Something worth mentioning about this card, we talked about it off the intro, and neither of us was super high on this card. Obviously, there's not a ton of divisional relevance here, especially considering that both of the participants in the main event are decisively inferior to your current champ, Israel Adesanya. But things that you can say for it, there are no heavyweight fights on this card. There's only one light heavyweight fight, and it's the curtain jerker. And there's a ton of men's flyweight fights, and then several more men's bantamweight and featherweight. So at the very least, it should be a real breezy night of action. And we stick in the men's flyweight division here for a matchup between Carlos Hernandez and Denise Bondar. Hernandez, the 29-year-old fighting out of Chicago, is 8-2 overall. He's 1-1 since joining the UFC out of Dana White's Contender Series. Fought most recently back in January, getting choked out in the first round by Alan Nascimento. Prior to that, he won a split decision over Victor Altamirano in a real fun fight last February. So he'll look to get back in the win column here against Bondar, the 30-year-old Ukrainian who, forget what the UFC tells you when he's walking out, he is 14-3. He is not 16-2 or 16-3 or whatever they'll say he is. Just a quick side note that he and his team have some misrepresentation and attempted fraud on the Sherdog Fight Finder that I'll leave the story for Jay Petrie to tell one day. At any rate, he came to the UFC last year as the outgoing champ of WWFC, which, for what it's worth, is probably the best promotion in the Ukraine. They obviously are not operating in Ukraine right now, but he debuted last February against Malcolm Gordon, where he succumbed to a grisly arm injury after about 90 seconds of action. He's been out ever since then, so 15, 16 months later, he gets his second chance at his first UFC win, and he is not favored to do so. He's the slightest of underdogs here. Hernandez is minus 125, Bondar even money plus 100, depending on your outlet of choice. Hernandez is yet one more fighter on this card that I'm going to say he's one of those guys that's good everywhere. He's well-rounded. He's good in transition between the phases of MMA. And so his success and failure against UFC level fighters has generally depended and is going to depend on the extent to which he can match up against his opponent's weak spots. Against Victor Altamirano, there weren't really any. Altamirano is a very similar fighter to himself. I mean, Altamirano is like a little different build, but it just in terms of being an aggressive, high work rate guy who's good everywhere. And so we got a really close fight that was a whole lot of fun. He beat Altamirano by split decision. I think I may actually have scored it for Altamirano. I'd have to look, but at any rate, that for me certified Hernandez as a guy that's, unless he makes a radical left or right turn somewhere, probably won't ever be a title contender at 125, but should stick around and be a lot of fun while he lasts. Runs into Alan Nascimento and gets crushed in 3 minutes. That I mean, that's par for the course as well. I think Alan Nascimento is very, very good. And
yeah,
Hernandez almost didn't have time to avoid running into the Alan Nascimento trap. Like Nascimento, he presents as a submission specialist, but he's good on the feet, and a lot of his submissions come after hurting people on the feet.
He's a shoot box guy. He's like a mini Charles Oliveira.
Yeah. I mean, by their bleached hair, Shell, you know them. He's one of them. So all Hernandez has really done for me so far is kind of hold serve. I feel as though Bondar is very much more the unknown quantity here, because like fake record aside, he's a pretty good fighter, but I didn't think he was that great even in his final run in WWFC. Just he wasn't fighting the best of the best guys even available in that part of the world at the time. And his problem is, even though he has twice as many fights almost as Hernandez, he feels more like a raw prospect. He's a good athlete who has good individual skills. He's a good submission artist. He's a good wrestler. He hits hard, but he's wild on the feet, and he experienced success on the regional scene in Ukraine and in the CIS, mostly because he could just overwhelm people by being a better athlete, being a harder hitter. But in the UFC, the kind of wild scrambling groundwork that he favors is going to get him nowhere, because the top 10 in the flyweight division are either people who will not have any of that nonsense at all, like Haikara France, or they are people who will do it and are way better at it than him, like Alex Perez, Brandon Moreno, Alessandro Pantoja. So
Royval.
Brandon Royval. Yeah, of course. Brandon Royval might be the top of all of them.
And Moreno.
I mentioned Moreno. It's if
they scramble like stray cats.
They do.
Stray cats fighting. Like those. And
yeah,
I totally agree with you on that.
It's like, I mean, Bondar wading forward, just winging like wild hooks, and then just not even necessarily always shooting a takedown, but just waiting for a collision and just trusting his better athleticism and instincts to come out on top there is going to get him nowhere against the best flyweights in the world. And I don't even think it's going to get him anywhere against Hernandez here. Like, nothing I've seen out of Bondar makes me think he's going to just be able to plunk Hernandez and then throttle him with just such speed like Alan Nascimento did. So even if Bondar gets the better of some of the exchanges, I think Hernandez is at least as durable. And speaking of durable, this will be the first time we've seen Bondar since that nasty arm injury. And the thing is, even before the arm injury, that arm was probably compromised by Gordon having a real good armbar attempt in. Oh, and by the way, Gordon had been piecing him up on the feet. And Gordon is a borderline like UFC flyweight. Like, he's not great himself. He's about a 500 fighter in the UFC, or even below 500. Yeah, it's not going to be a good night for Bondar, I don't think. It'll probably be a lot of fun. He's going to come out like a house on fire. He's going to force a wild melee. It probably will hit the ground in the first round. And I just trust Hernandez to be more composed, more fundamentally sound, probably stronger. And I'm not going to pick the finish here because it took something kind of freakish for Bondar to get finished by Gordon. But I expect Hernandez to win 3 rounds comfortably here and kind of continue to expose the limitation in Bondar's game.
Yeah, I think for what did you say, decision?
Yeah, I said decision for Hernandez.
I think for Hernandez, like, I don't think he's going to be as fast as Bondar, but pretty sure Bondar has every single one of the wins on his record via finish. I don't think he's ever won a decision on his pro record, at least. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm like 90% sure.
Wait, are you talking about Hernandez or you're talking about Bondar?
Bondar. Bondar's won every one of.
Yeah, Bondar's got 100% finish rate in victory. Yep.
But like, again, getting any top 15 flyweight is going to hurt Malcolm Gordon on the feet.
Yeah.
Like, Malcolm Gordon doesn't have striking success over high-ranked flyweights, and that's like a red flag for me. I don't think Hernandez is venomous enough anywhere to hurt Bondar, but if he can just like make him chill and just slow the fight down, slow his game down, avoid the scrappling, avoid this, the scrambles, the grappling, he could just put a jab in his face almost, just because Bondar's game is just like so wiry and weird, where, just like you said, where he wants to just start something weird and rely on his athleticism to come out on top. He could also very well go out there, force a scramble, something weird, and just catch him in a submission. That could totally happen because that's what he wants to do. Is it likely? Maybe 3 out of 10 times. But I think the other 70% of the time, Hernandez just kind of wins a nuts and bolts, defends grappling, puts a jab in his face. Hernandez has pretty good boxing, and he can scramble too. And I mean, if he can just win or avoid the first grappling, scrambling exchange that Bondar will probably want to initiate, I think that'll tell you if he wins the fight or not. I'll also agree. I think he wins a decision. But if there's 2 rounds of Bondar just doing weird stuff and losing and not having success, he could also maybe hurt him if he gets tired. It's really hard to base someone's game and off their record if you look at Bondar, just because people say Khabib had a padded record coming into the UFC, but he came into the UFC and probably became the most dominant fighter in the history of the UFC as far as dominance over the opponent. But I don't know if someone with a record like Bondar, and Bondar being who he is, I don't know if he has the ability to do something like that. I hope he proves me wrong, because that would be great, but I don't think it's very likely. What was the exact arm injury he had? Was it elbow or shoulder?
It was elbow.
Like hyperextended, right?
Yeah, like something like
ligaments.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, as a fighter, that's a tough type of injury to like rehab, probably need surgeries. That could also impact him as well. Yeah, I'm going to go with Hernandez by decision.
All right. Next up on the UFC Vegas 75 prelims is a bantamweight matchup between Kang and Christian Quinonez. Kang, the 35-year-old Korean, is 18-9 with 1 no contest overall. He is 7-3 with 1 no contest since joining the UFC as the former Rhode FC bantamweight Grand Prix winner. He is coming off a win, took a unanimous decision over Dana Batkari at UFC 275 last June. Just over a year later, he steps back into the cage against Quinonez. The 27-year-old Mexican is 18-3 overall. He is 1-0 in the UFC. Came out of the Contender Series in 2021. His debut was delayed because of visa issues, so didn't actually step into the cage until last September, where he knocked out Khalid Taha late in the first round. So a long-awaited, much-anticipated debut went really well for him. Here, he is favored to follow it up with another win, as he is minus 170, Kang plus 140 on the comeback. I like Kang. I feel as though he is one of the last of the old school South Korean fighters, because you've been a fan long enough to remember when the stereotype of the Korean fighter was that they were all maniacs, just super, super aggressive, wild men on the feet and on the ground. And I feel as though Kang is one of the last ones that really fits that mold. And no surprise that he comes from like Busan Team Mad, where 2 of his most notable teammates are like Ryo Chonan and Sohee like Hamderlei Silva Ham, 2 of the just most psycho aggressive fighters of all time. And he fits that mold. He is aggressive to a fault. Throws good power. He's an underrated wrestler, like a lot of guys from that camp were, because they never look like they want to wrestle, but then all of a sudden the fight's on the ground and they're in the other guy's guard, and it was just an effortless reactive double or hip toss or whatever. At this point, I was surprised to see that he's 35. He still feels younger to me, just because he's been inactive for stretches due to injury, and he's in a division, I'm 135, where 35 is old. 35 is old, and we're talking about a guy that took all of 2020 and almost all of 2021 off, in that case mostly just because of like the difficulty of Korean fighters fighting during COVID. But he had like 3-year layoffs in the mid 2010s. It doesn't look like it, because hell, Dana Batkari is arguably as good a win as he has in his entire career, but he is definitely aging. And he's getting to the point where this approach of his that really depends on sharp reflexes in the pocket and depends on gas and depends on his chin, it's going to abandon him at some point here. And this might be the time for all we know. He used to be like when he got to the UFC back. Oh man, he's been in the UFC for a decade.
So
There you
long.
go. He's been in the UFC for 10 years and he has 11 fights. That's the problem with Kyung Kang right there. He was 24 when he got to the UFC. He's 35 now. He was huge. Well, he was Korean huge when he got to the UFC. He has that stereotypical Korean fighter body, and I would include, fighters like Hun Yu Lim and Dong Hyun Kim in this, where you look at him from on the front, you're like, how is this guy fighting at 170 or 135 or whatever? Because they're super tall for the weight class. They got broad shoulders, like they look like they have plenty of muscle on them, but then they turn to the side and they're like a playing card. And Yushin Okami, Japanese fighter, also had this body type where they don't cut weight, they like cut depth. Like
they read like a popsicle stick sideways.
Well, Hun Yu Lim looked like he could get onto elevators without opening the door. He could just like turn the slide like a credit card. But by modern standards, he's just a decent sized bantamweight, and he's gonna be smaller than Quinonez. He's gonna be older than Quinonez. I like Quinonez as a prospect. It's a bummer that it took him a full year to get his UFC debut, but he's still just 27 years old and just barely turned 27. The funny thing is, I was excited for him to get to the UFC, but then in his debut and even on the Contender Series, he looked even better than he had fighting in Mexico and in Brave CF. Yeah. Because I thought, okay, here's a huge guy with good power, well-rounded skills. He has a decent ground game, but he's like really wild and defensively porous. And for a guy that has reach on almost everybody at bantamweight and has tons of power, it would be great if he used a jab. And then all of a sudden against Khalid Taha, he pieced Taha the hell up, and it's the jab that made everything else work. Like, I want to say he cut Taha, but like Taha, who all he wanted to do in that fight was get in and land a huge power punch, or get in and, wrestle Quinonez to the ground and try to beat him up there. Quinonez just completely stymied him with the jab. And once Taha was kind of frozen in his tracks and out of his game plan, then he starts mixing in his other strikes and just really destroyed Taha in 3 minutes. And I think Taha's actually a pretty good fighter. Here, if Kang brings his usual, Hamderlei Silva approach to this fight, I think Quinonez is going to piece him up. Kang will be running at a guy that's bigger, has better single strike power, is more disciplined as a striker. And I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Kang will be able to get Quinonez to the ground if he wants to. So I've already picked at least one upset here and one big upset, but here we're not a betting show, but this is one where I wouldn't be mad if the line were even wider than it is. I like Quinonez against Kang better than -170. Give me Quinonez I'm going to say by decision here, because Kang is typically pretty damn durable. I mean, he hasn't been finished in the UFC period. Like, he hasn't been finished since he was like 19 years old fighting in Korea. Unless all the wheels have fallen off, I don't think he gets finished here. So give me Quinonez by a lopsided decision where Kang looks busted up and like he's been run over by a truck at the end of the fight, and Quinonez like looks fresh as a daisy and says he wants to fight somebody in 3 weeks.
Yeah, if Quinonez can avoid the first or second grappling exchange, and then also can mix using his jab to stop Mr. Perfect from just crashing the pocket. Kyung Kang looked good against Dana Bakare. Like, I was surprised his boxing had, fired. He's kind of firing on all cylinders in that fight. But then Dana Bakare has kind of, not looked great. Didn't look great his last time out. Got sparked out. So that kind of, took a little bit of juice out of that win for me. Kyung Kang, I do like his nickname, Mr. Perfect.
It's so ironic because he has the least perfect fight style ever. Like, its imperfection is what makes him awesome. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
And Quinonez, I think he's just gonna have success with that jab. Kang is going to try to crash the pocket. Like, that's what he does.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's just aggressive. And if Quinonez hits him with the jab, stops him from crashing the pocket 2 or 3 times, I really like how he can build off of his jab. Like, that's something I really like to see, fighters that can land the jab and use that for more setups, use it to, fire things off, use it to just set up other offense. I mean, going to compare him to someone that's great, but like someone like Max Holloway does that, or even like Dustin Poirier does that. The second Dustin Poirier hits you with the southpaw jab, the next step is he's going to line you up with his check right. And I think Quinonez has a similar boxing game to that, where he actually has learned to use his jab and then set up other things off that jab. He could, again, this could be another one of those fights where the other guy can just take the back foot and just put a jab on him and land crosses when he wants to, set up check hooks when he wants to. Kang has not been a dude that's been super defensively sound. Do I think Quinonez is going to knock him out? No, but he's younger, he's bigger, probably faster, equally durable, and like you said, one dude's fought 11 times in the past 10 years at the organization. Like, as a bantamweight, that's not the type of schedule you need to be keeping. Bantamweights don't even last 10 years.
Yeah.
Like this, kind of all over Quinonez here. I think he's just going to put a jab on him again. I'm going to say by decision. It'd be cool if he finished him because it'd be the first person to in the UFC, but probably not likely. I think he'll take a decision though.
We head back to the men's flyweight division for the third and last time on this card for a matchup between Jimmy Flick and Alessandro Costa. Flick, the 32-year-old Oklahoman, is 16-6 overall. He is 1-1 since joining the UFC out of the 2020 season of Dana White's Contender Series. He debuted in the UFC back in December of 2020. Sensational. I mean, about as exciting a debut as you're ever going to see in the UFC. Like one of the most exciting debuts since Anderson Silva, way back in 2006 or 7 or whenever it was, when he flying triangle choked Cody Durden, a win that actually has aged really well as Durden has turned into a pretty solid rising contender. He retired in the wake of that win, going out on top, except that he came back. He came back this January at UFC Fight Night Strickland versus Imavov, and Charles Johnson put him away late in the first round. So Flick ruined his first retirement. Let's see if he can unruin his second career against Costa. The 27-year-old Brazilian is 12-3 overall. He is 0-1 since joining the UFC as a veteran of the 2022 Dana White's Contender Series. He won a split decision there, didn't get signed immediately. So he went back to Brazil to Lux Fight League, knocked some dude out in 10 seconds. And came in for a short notice debut last December. Amir Albazi was supposed to fight Brandon Royval. Royval had to withdraw. Costa came in on short notice. A tough ask against Albazi, but more or less stayed competitive until he was knocked out midway through the third round. So odds here do favor him pretty heavily to get things back on track, as Costa is minus 245, Flick plus 195 as the nearly 2-1 underdog. So here's the problem with Jimmy Flick. Obviously, when you have 16 wins and 14 of them are by submission, and your debut in the UFC, you flying triangle choked somebody, there's a certain expectation of what kind of fighter you are. I mean, to have that many submissions and no TKOs, you're looking at like Hani Yaya territory. But he's not Hani Yaya. He's not Damian Maia. He is a hyper-aggressive, opportunistic grappler who really couldn't make it work against bantamweights at the regional level, because he was a bantamweight at the regional level. And you look back, he lost to the decent fighters he fought that were bantamweights. He lost to Chris Gutierrez, who's in the UFC now. Levi Moles in LFA, where, yeah, he's a pretty good sized bantamweight to the point that Moles has trouble making bantamweight. But dropping to 125 in the UFC is basically just put him against kind of the same size guys, because so many fighters fight at 135 on regional scenes, then drop to 125 in the UFC. And he just doesn't have the rest of the skill set to make that approach go at a UFC level, because he grappled Charles Johnson. Like, he got him in the situation where a true specialist like Jimmy Flick is supposed to be able to win, and Johnson swept him and then pounded him out.
Yeah,
that's a problem. Yeah, he's a quick strike grappler. As much as I think his grappling is a little overrated, or that's not fair. Like, obviously, almost all of his career wins are by submission. His grappling is not as complete as, his specialist identity would lead you to believe. I think his striking is a little underrated. He's a perfectly good fundamental boxer. He will throw kicks. He has the unafraid kicking game of a guy that wishes you would take him down, but not a whole lot of power, even for flyweight. And again, while he can submit anybody anytime, more fundamentally sound grapplers have been able to take advantage of him. Anyone who's a better wrestler, again, Levi Moles, have been able to just kind of control him and not run into too much danger. Here against Costa, at the very least, I mean, Costa gets a pass for stepping up on short notice and fighting Amir Albazi. Amir Albazi just almost beat Kai Kara France and got his hand raised anyway. But the point is, he definitely certified himself as a guy that belongs in the top 10. Costa looked pretty competitive against him, all those things considered. And he's a terrible matchup for Flick, because he's a good grappler himself, and he's a more conservative grappler, which means if Flick goes for a flying armbar and it doesn't work, all of a sudden Flick's going to be like lying on his back with Costa standing over him, and Costa hits like a truck. So I think Costa should be able to take care of himself, keep lightning from striking again, and he has a major power advantage over Flick. I think Costa's gonna probably make it a short night. Give me Alessandro Costa by KO in the first round here.
Yeah, Flick's problem too is, like, he's one of those guys that reacts when he gets hit and gets hurt whenever he gets hit.
Yeah,
like, he's just not a durable dude for a flyweight. You can, when heavyweights get hit by other heavyweights, it's rare that they don't get hurt.
Yeah.
But like most guys in the lower weight classes, they just have to be better. And that also means more durable. Flick's got a really good opportunistic, like, snatch a submission and a scramble type game. That just flying triangle, like, the chances of him.
It was so good.
And Cody Durden is, he beat Charles Johnson.
Yeah.
And he's.
I think if he and Flick fought 10 times, I think Durden probably wins 8 of them.
Yeah.
Just Flick caught lightning in a bottle. It was amazing. Yeah.
And Durden's also probably better than Alessandro Costa. Like, Durden's actually pretty good.
Yep.
And Flick is such a weird guy. He's really hard to just, get a good beat on, because he has all those wins by finish, all those submission wins. But then you really watch the tape on him, and, like, you're like, oh, he's getting buzzed there. Oh, he's getting hurt. Even Charles Johnson, like, hurt him on the ground, but, like, right away. Like, the ground and pound happened and he was hurt and done immediately. And he's only lost. He has 6 losses and only one of them is via decision. All the rest of them are by finish. TKO and KO, where he just gets hurt. Costa would be smart to probably just be an anti-wrestler in this fight and just try to strike with Flick. I think that's going to be the key for him to win this fight. Just because Flick is just dangerous there. Anyone that would be, willing to sit in his guard on top, even if you're winning for 3 minutes of a 5-minute round there, like, it's just not a good place to be against someone like Flick.
No.
As weird as he is. Because his game is just a weird game. Like, get on the front foot, decent striker, want to scramble, want to force grappling, and want to get that submission. But again, how successful will that be at the UFC level with his durability issues? He's not the fastest dude either. Like, he's not some bolt the lightning dude where he can, he doesn't have like a Hamzat Chimaev grappling submission game where he's lightning with a single or a double, take your back, force a scramble, and squeeze your head off. That's not Flick's game. His record would make you think that's his game, but like that's just not it. I'm gonna lean Alessandro, but like I kind of want Flick to win and retire because his story is just so cool. Like his whole entire like life story. He's got a book, and I low-key think his retirement was to promote his book. But that's another story for another time. Go with Costa. I do like to see Flick fight though, just because it's always something crazy.
The top prelim at UFC on ESPN 47 is a welterweight matchup between Nicolas Dalby and Muslim Salikhov. Dalby, the 38-year-old Dane, is 21-4-1 with 2 no contests overall. He is 5-3-1 with 1 no contest across multiple stints in the UFC. He is 4-1 with 1 no contest since being back. He was cut from the UFC back in 2016. Went over and fought in Europe, primarily in Cage Warriors, had some admitted problems with alcohol, depression, turned things around, and has been fighting the best he ever has ever since. As I said, he's 4-1 with 1 no contest since being back in the UFC. He's on a 2-fight win streak. Most recently fought back in January at UFC 283, where he took a split decision over Warley Alves. So he'll be looking to make it 3 in a row as he pushes his 40th birthday. And standing in his way will be a guy who's even closer to his 40th birthday in the form of Salikhov. The 39-year-old Dagestani is 19-3 overall. He's 5-3 in the UFC. He won his most recent outing. That was back in November at UFC Fight Night Zechekwu versus Kudalaba, where he put away Andre Fialho in the 3rd round with a knockout of the year contender, a spinning wheel kick. That allowed him to bounce back from a knockout loss to Li Jingliang last July. So Salikhov looking to make it 2 in a row, Dalby 3 in a row. Salikhov is the moderate favorite to get it done. He's out there around minus 180 or so on most books. Dalby around plus 150 on the comeback. The thing about Nicolas Dalby is, the end is coming at some point. Nicolas Dalby is a shoe-in for the Hall of fucking Awesome 1 year after his last fight. But for a guy who's 38 years old, has put some hard miles on himself outside of the cage as well as inside the cage, by his own admission. Again, this is a guy that kind of had a lost year of just kind of, drinking and had to get himself back into shape, and is 38 and is known for blood and guts battles. It's impressive that he's fighting as well as he is now. There's every reason to expect the wheels would have fallen off already. We're talking about a guy that has a no contest because there was too much blood on the floor of the cage and it wasn't safe. It was like a fucking slip and slide of blood. It looked like a deleted scene from The Shining.
Like an Evil Dead scene.
Yeah, something from The Evil Dead where just comic amounts of blood are gushing everywhere. They never did find Ross Houston. So
he drowned.
Yeah, he may have drowned. And it's going to be sad when it does, because I don't know him personally. I've never even interviewed him, but just comes across as an incredibly likable guy, a good dude. I always have a soft spot in my heart for fighters who are open about mental health and substance abuse issues. I'd rather have, 10 of him than one of Stephan Bonnar, just to throw one name out there. But it's going to come crashing to a halt at some point. And man, Muslim Salikhov is just the kind of guy to bring it to a crashing halt.
He's just a mother effort.
He is.
Salikhov.
He is. I mean, the guy is almost 40. Again, he's 39. He just turned 39 a couple days ago. So he's a little older than Dalby. He has over 20 career fights, and before that, he had a long career in striking. He's a multiple-time world Wushu Sanda champion. He really is kind of the second coming of Alexander Shlemenko. I mean, he's got the whole thing, the kind of short, dumpy, almost pot-bellied build for the division, the all spinning shit all the time approach, even the hairline. He's got the Alexander Shlemenko, like from the right angle, I look like the Tesla logo haircut, where he's got this widow's peak that's almost like a narrow spike down the front of his head.
Like the Avatar cartoon.
Yeah. He got the arrow like Aang, the last airbender. But Salikhov, it's all deceptive. Like everything you think you know about Muslim Salikhov after watching a highlight reel or one of his fights is not true. Despite being average size and not looking particularly in shape for the welterweight division, he has a fantastic gas tank. Despite a highlight reel of all spinning shit all the time, and again, lamping Fialho just 6 months ago with a spinning wheel kick, he is a good fundamental striker. He's kind of like Michel Pereira in that way, where Pereira came to the UFC as a complete wild man, throwing Showtime kicks where most fighters would throw a jab. But when he decided to settle down, it's like, oh, I can just sit here and actually outstrike Chaos Williams in a regular kickboxing match too. That's Salikhov. Yeah. And I thought Salikhov's performance against Andre Fialho was incredible. And it may just turn out, we'll find out a year from now, well, we're already finding out that Fialho's chin is prematurely shot. But going into that fight, Salikhov is older by a full decade. Fialho is bigger. He's younger. Fialho arguably has better one-shot power. Like Fialho is the one-punch knockout guy, and Salikhov chews him up at range, chews him up inside.
He's faster than him.
Fialho gets tired first, and Salikhov really only uncorks the exotic stuff when, what's his name stands up and goes finish him. It's not Shao Kahn. Who's the Shang Tsung? When Shang Tsung, says finish him, that's when Salikhov uncorks the spinning stuff. Until then, he'd just been beating Fialho with a greater diversity of strikes, because Fialho is primarily a boxer. It was a fantastic performance by Salikhov. It's exactly what he needed, because his loss to Li Jingliang made a lot of people, myself included, go, okay, here's where the fun ends, because Lee was kind of built for him to style on, but Lee survived, waved away all the nonsense, and dropped him with one huge punch. If he can do that, certainly Andre Fialho can, and Salikhov looked like a new man.
Yeah.
Dalby is an aggressive, come-forward boxer who throws kicks, who is surprisingly adept on the ground. He is, maybe there's just one kind of Danish fighter, because he's the second coming of Martin Kampmann that way. Yeah. Without having wasted any of his career up at 185 pounds, like fighting much huger guys. But Dalby is going to march forward. He's going to box. He's going to feint. He's going to stick his jab out there, try to start throwing his right cross. He'll mix in kicks. I mean, he's willing to wrestle, but none of that is going to do him much good against Salikhov. Salikhov, despite the spinning shit, still is from Dagestan. He's a very underrated wrestler, offensively as well as defensively. I just don't think there's any safe place for Dalby here. And if there was one, Dalby wouldn't be looking for it. He's not a guy who looks for the safe place. Like, he wants to win blood and guts battles. Here, I think he's going to get one, and I don't think he's going to win it. Give me Salikhov to do kind of the same thing he did to Fialho. Get the better of things early, really get the better of things by the middle of the fight. By the time Dalby starts looking for a takedown in earnest, I think he's probably already going to be compromised. Give me Salikhov by his second, third round knockout in a row, probably another one for the highlight reel. And even before it lands, Dalby already looks like he's been thrown into a wood chipper, sad as it makes me to say.
Dalby's game is very front foot aggressive, very pressuring. He's a super grinder, and someone that is, even at 39, that's as like athletic and just explosive as Salikhov, and has great timing with their strikes and can throw strikes from all different ranges. I mean, he can knock you out with a straight shot down the middle. He can also knock you out with a spinning wheel kick, and he can time all of those and land them accurately. He can kind of just do everything when it comes to striking. I can see places that Dalby has success if he doesn't get hurt continuously getting into the pocket over and over again. Salikhov's wrestling into grappling game, he's got a lot of judo trips and stuff like that. He's really good with that. He's also really good with redirecting opponents that come at him with forward pressure. That's where his judo game kind of comes in. He's just such a weird Dagestan fighter too. He doesn't really fit their mold. With just like you said, all of his weird.
Well, he's 90% of them are from the Khabib mold, and the other 10% are from the Magomed Sharipov,
whirling dervish of.
Yeah, and that's Salikhov. Where Magomed Sharipov could wrestle, he wrestled Calvin Kattar, to make sure he won that fight, but would prefer to spin shit. Yeah.
But his spinny shit is super accurate and fine tuned and not and not ugly. He's one of the dudes in MMA that's spinning shit that's super clean and cut. I think he's gonna probably hurt Dalby. Salikhov's durable enough. The only thing that if he gasses out in this fight, if 2 minutes and 30 seconds of the second round go by and he gets tired, Dalby will put the pressure on him. And if you give Dalby an inch, he'll take 2, then he'll take 4, then he'll take 4 feet, and then he'll take a mile. That's just kind of how Dalby is, where if you let the ball get rolling on him, he's just gonna have more and more success. But Dalby's game is just built to get hurt by someone like Salikhov. That's really it. That's the only thing I see. And Salikhov has power in 15 minutes of a fight, from minute 1 to minute 15. Don't know if he knocks him out, but I could see him hurting him. It'd be cool if he knocked him out, so I'll say 3rd round knockout.
The 6-fight main card of UFC on ESPN 47 begins with a bantamweight matchup between Ronnie Barcelos and Miles Johns. Barcelos, the 36-year-old Brazilian, is 17-4 overall. He is 6-3 since joining the UFC as a former RFA champ, which will let you know how long he's been in the UFC, because LFA and RFA have been together for 7 years now or something. He did lose his last time out, and in fact, he's lost 3 of his last 4. Most recently, he was out there at UFC Fight Night Strickland versus Imavov in January, where he was knocked out late in the first round by Umar Nurmagomedov. Prior to that, he had a unanimous decision win over Trevin Jones last October. So he's looking to get back in the green. Standing in his way will be Johns. The 29-year-old Texan by way of Kansas is 13-2 overall. He is 4-2 since joining the UFC out of the 3rd season of Dana White's Contender Series. He's coming off a win that was back in November at the Zechikwu versus Kudalaba fight night, where he took a unanimous decision over Vince Morales. Prior to that, he was choked out in the 3rd round by John Castaneda at UFC Fight Night Hermanson versus Strickland. Odds here favor Barcelos pretty heavily. He is minus 240, Johns plus 190 on the comeback. I alluded to it before. Keith and I were super, super high on Ronnie Barcelos a couple years ago, but in our defense,
you had every reason to be.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was after he beat Said Nurmagomedov.
Yeah,
because Barcelos debuted in the UFC, won his first 5 fights in the UFC, which put him on a 9 or 10 fight win streak in total, but they were quality wins. He beat Chris Gutierrez, and Chris Gutierrez went on to win his next 8 fights in the UFC. He beat Said Nurmagomedov, and Nurmagomedov went on to win his next 4 fights in the UFC. He was beating people who were on the rise. He wasn't beating lame ducks or fighters who were over the hill. The problem, and the thing about it, was how he was winning, because it was in such an airtight fashion. He was just dominating people. Like, I think he won all 3 rounds against Nurmagomedov, out-wrestled him badly. And when you out-wrestle someone named Nurmagomedov badly, that's a good look. But things have just sort of, they've fallen off, because at his best, he was very well-rounded, good boxer with surprisingly good power, excellent grappler, and very good wrestler. And one of
He's
those
a
guys,
Brazilian that can wrestle.
I was going to say, he didn't wrestle like a Brazilian, because when you think of, it's no longer really the case, but classically, when you think of Brazilian with a good takedown game, it was either someone like Damian Maia, who just came up with an arsenal of just tricky trips and throws and standing back takes to make up for his lack of an amateur wrestling background or plus athleticism, or was like Jacare, who had outstanding athleticism and actually learned some basic double leg and single leg takedowns.
Sure.
Barcelos wrestles like somebody who at least wrestled at a high level in high school and maybe did like some junior college. That's how he was at his best. And it was driven by like plus athleticism. He was explosive and he was extremely strong for the weight class. And it's not disappeared. It's not like he looks like, it's not 2012 Johnny Hendricks and 2015 Johnny Hendricks. Like he didn't, but as a guy who was a little old to be at those stages of his career anyway, he was already well into his 30s and has had some pretty serious injuries. It's just caught up with him, and the division has caught up with him, because when he got to the UFC in 2018, bantamweight was promising, and in 2022, bantamweight might be the best division in the promotion. It's just sort of caught him and passed him. Like Umar Nurmagomedov, Victor Henry, Timur Valiev, there's not a shameful loss among them.
No.
And here, if Barcelos has anything left, John's really is tailor-made. Like John's, if you ranked out all the bantamweights in the UFC, he might be the highest ranked bantamweight, or one of the highest ranked bantamweights that Barcelos has this good a chance to beat. Like, I don't necessarily agree with him being a 2.5 to 1 favorite over him. It's just hard to have that kind of faith in Barcelos at age 36 after how he's looked over the last 2 years.
And the last time out, literally getting absolutely, I mean, that's like scary knockout, bad.
Yeah. And set up by a body shot, which is always, nasty stuff. And he's going against someone in John's that
can crack.
He can crack. He's not afraid to go to the body. And when he remembers to, he's a very good wrestler. Like, he's one who actually has a amateur wrestling background. He has the kind of athleticism that Barcelos had 5 years ago. Like, John's, like Barcelos, isn't big for the division. He's a compact, muscular guy, but he's got a rocket fast shot from the outside. All of his strikes have a ton of power on them. And while he does overswing sometimes, he doesn't have to overswing to have power. It's one of the frustrating things about Miles Johns, is that we've seen him hurt fighters really badly just by throwing a nice left hook that's just, nice, clean arc, didn't overswing. But then he'll also overswing, and that's what has, left him open to his opponent's offense. Like, Johns is still only 29 years old. That's good news. He's still got time to put the pieces together. I give this kind of update anytime a former Glory MMA and fitness fighter, is back in the cage. He stayed in Kansas. He's at Marathon MMA, which is it's Trey Ogden's team, and it's a real good team. So I'm glad that he's landed in what hopefully is a stable training situation that will help him continue to improve. But if you could assure me that Johns isn't going to make any big mistakes, and you could assure me that Barcelos is functionally the same as he was in his last fight, just in terms of his physical ability, I would put Barcelos as a slight favorite, but not a greater than 2 to 1 favorite. Here, I am worried enough about Barcelos's physical condition, again, especially after taking a bad knockout in his last fight, that if I was sure that John's, had his head screwed on fully, I'd call this almost a pick 'em. As it is, I do favor Barcelos because I expect John's is going to make a mistake. And Barcelos, if nothing else, is a veteran. He is, I mean, I hate using terms like wily and grizzled to describe a man who's more than 10 years younger than me, but he is becoming that kind of guy. And while his resilience is not what it once was, like his gas tank isn't what it was 5 years ago, his chin clearly isn't what it was, his offensive weapons are still in the same ballpark. If Johns makes a mistake, overswinging on something, leaving himself open, Barcelos can put him down with one punch, or Barcelos can take him to the ground, have his back in a flash, and choking him. Because of that, I favor Barcelos here, but if I were a betting man, which I'm really not, I wouldn't touch this thing with a 10-foot pole. Just, it's hard to feel confident in either guy at this point. And just, hopefully Johns is continuing to improve, but unless he's made market improvements and fights a really, really clean and composed fight, I think it's just a matter of time. And so give me Barcelos here. I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to say it makes it to decision. If Johns makes a mistake, I think Barcelos finishes this. Give me Barcelos by, I'm going to say, second round TKO. Just hurts Johns, falls into the ground, maybe pounds him out down there.
Barcelos is a Brazilian wrestling champion, if that tells you anything. To be a to be a high level wrestler in Brazil, I don't know what.
I mean, it's not the Kentucky Judo Federation.
Yeah, but Barcelos is a great wrestler. I could see him also just winning 3 rounds of wrestling. I could see him thinking, I am getting older. I am a good wrestler. He does have a good submission game built into that grappling. And knowing that he just got knocked out like really bad, being an older guy at bantamweight, I could totally see him just coming out and really just trying to wrestle. It's what I think this fight will look like. Barcelos is a weird dude that is he overhyped? Is he underhyped? I'm just confused by him at this point. He removed the age and like just the career trajectory. Like it kind of reminds me of someone like Miranda Maverick, where like everybody thought that they were like really, really good, and then they lost some fights and they kind of maybe beat the person they're supposed to. Like Trevin Jones, like you have to beat Trevin Jones because Trevin Jones doesn't fight. Like, so low output, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Where he'll allow you to wrestle him, he'll allow you to add 2 and 3 strikes to his 1. So Barcelos is always going to beat a dude like that. But then you look at the Victor Henry fight, and Victor Henry is kind of a regional underground MMA OG, and he's good. And Victor Henry like kind of styled on him.
Yes.
Side note, it's crazy that the UFC convinced Timur Valiev to be on The Ultimate Fighter. Like, he's way too good for that.
They may have just been like, dude, it's a free place to stay for 6 weeks.
Yeah, and we'll give you booze and you get to train with like whatever, yeah. Sure. But like even his loss against Timur Valiev, like Valiev is actually like really good. I still do lean Barcelos here. He's just a good wrestler, and it's hard to pick against dudes that have the ability to, have a nip-tuck striking game, because he does have a pretty nip-tuck striking game, but then can just wrestle. I just think he's going to come and wrestle. I think he's going to, probably win 3 rounds, and the 3rd round he'll win grappling. The first one he'll win grappling, but I think the 3rd one will be more dominant than the first. That's kind of what I'm leaning on.
We head now to the lightweight division for a matchup between Manuel Torres and Nicolas Mota. Torres, the 28-year-old Mexican, is 13-2 overall. He is 1-0 since joining the UFC out of the 2021 season of Dana White's Contender Series. He has not fought in 13 months. Made his UFC debut last May, where he knocked out Frank Camacho late in the first round. He'll look to make it 2 in a row against Mota. The 30-year-old Brazilian is 13-4 overall. He is 1-1 since joining the UFC, also out of Dana White's Contender Series. He debuted, of course. He was the victim that introduced us to the newfound late career power of Jim A10 Miller, getting knocked out in the second round by a man that up until very recently was not known for knocking people out. But he bounced back from that with a nasty knockout of his own, putting away Cameron Van Camp late in the first round at UFC Fight Night Sandhagen versus Song last September. So he also looking to make it 2 in a row here. He is not favored to do so. Torres is minus 170, Mota around plus 140 as your underdog. These are two fighters that on their way up to the UFC were very much quick finish artists, both hyper aggressive, both have a ton of not just first round finishes on the record, but a bunch of like finishes and 2-minute finishes, 1-minute finishes. The difference is that Torres actually has a diversity of offensive tools that enable him to do that, where Mota is more limited. And Torres also, he's younger, he's bigger, he himself is more durable, or specifically, he's more durable against the things that Mota does. Like, this is not a good matchup for Nicolas Mota.
Like those prolonged pocket exchanges, like what Mota does, where he just wants to like have a prolonged exchange in the pocket and hit and kind of counter your counter with a big shot. Like, that's just where Torres eats people up.
Exactly. Mota, yeah, I mean, he wants to be
like a Jim Miller fight.
It will. He wants to be in the phone booth, throwing hooks, throwing uppercuts, and just trusting his reflexes to keep his chin out of the way or be able to roll with stuff until he hits you with something harder and puts you down. It was very successful on, in like Shudo Brazil and stuff. It worked. It worked against Cameron Van Camp, but dude, if 39-year-old Jim Miller was able to stand in the pocket with you and put you down, that's not going to be a recipe for success against the rest of the lightweight division, because most of them can crack, and most of them are a lot more durable and quicker than Jim Miller at this point. And Torres is absolutely that. Torres, he can hit hard. He doesn't mind pocket exchanges, but he's also a good striker at range. And he has a quick opportunistic submission game as well. He's been vulnerable on the ground. I mean, his last couple of losses were quick submission losses, but that's not what Mota's going to try to do to him. If Mota slides for like an Imanari roll in the first round of this fight, I'll throw something across the room. Like, Mota's going to come across swinging hooks like a miniature Vanderlei Silva, and there's a chance he catches Torres and
he cracks. Sure.
Yeah, he hits super, super hard. But again, giving up reach, giving up height against a guy who's more defensively sound, has better reach, has more diverse offensive tools, it's hard to pick him. And Mota's going to live by the sword or die by the sword. So I don't see the point in picking a decision here. Give me Torres by, I'm going to say first round TKO. And it's not because I think he's a million times better than Mota. I just think that Mota's going to force the fight on the terms and in a way that's going to lead to him getting carried out.
Yeah, like Torres literally just did that to Frank Camacho.
Yep.
Like, it's the same, like, I just think it's like a super similar fight, It
is. I mean, Mota's better than Camacho, but
they both die the same way.
Yeah.
Like, and they both win the same way. That's kind of like, and they have like a just super similar game. And like, Torres loses fights in leg entanglements, like kind of high level BJJ style submissions. And like, that's just not Mota's game either. Like, he's not going to be dropping back for a heel hook. Like, that's just not, like, he lost via knee bar. Like, only high level due to knee bars. Like, that's got to be your game, and that's just like not his game.
So you're saying Mota by Suloev stretch? Yeah,
something, it'll look like Karini Silva, which is cool as shit. But that's just not going to happen. Torres is probably going to hurt him in the pocket. and it's probably going to be within the first 3 exchanges. He'll probably win via finish in the first 3 minutes of this fight.
We head now to the featherweight division for a matchup between Pat Sabatini and Lucas Almeida. Sabatini, the 32-year-old Pennsylvania native, is 17-4 overall. He is 4-1 since joining the UFC as the outgoing CFFC featherweight champ. He won his first 4 fights in the UFC, part of the kind of wave of Renzo Gracie Philly fighters that put together a ridiculous amount of consecutive wins between the team. He was not the first of that crew to lose, but he did lose his most recent outing back in September at UFC Fight Night Sandhagen versus Song. He got front kicked to the face by Damon Jackson, of all people. One of the more shocking outcomes in any UFC fight last year, just for who did what, how, when. Yeah. So he'll be looking to come back from that against Almeida. 32-year-old Brazilian is 14-1 overall. He is 1-0 in the UFC. His only career loss was on the Contender Series back in 2021, where he dropped a competitive decision to Daniel Zellhuber, went back and won one more fight in Jungle Fight, then got the call up to face Mike Trizano. That was almost exactly a year ago at UFC Fight Night Volkov versus Rosenstrike. He ended up knocking out Trizano early in the 3rd round, and will now look to pick up his second UFC win. He is not favored to do so. Sabatini minus 180. Almeida is plus 150. Poor Lucas Almeida. He is an absolutely titanic featherweight. I mean, he's like 6'1", not skinny. He's a big featherweight, and
they literally gave him Zellhuber, who was just huge.
I was gonna say, and the UFC seems bent on just hooking him up with guys that can look him in the eye, because Zellhuber might even be bigger. Trizano is huge. I mean, Trizano, his most standout line of his bio, other than being a tough winner, is continued inability to make 145 on any consistent basis. Here, he does finally get somebody he has a size advantage over, but it's not a great style matchup for him. I kind of underestimated Sabatini coming in as a CFFC champ. I figured he'd slot into the featherweight division as just another guy. I did not think of him as one of the standouts from Renzo Gracie Philly as he came to the UFC. And he's just been better than I expected him to be. The thing that really has stood out to me is what a good wrestler he is.
Yeah.
He was an effective wrestler on the regional level, but he's been maybe even more effective at the UFC level against a higher level of fighter. It's just, he stepped it up, or it's forced him to show it. But I mean, he was already known to be a good grappler, outstanding grappler, and he's a very good kind of wrestle grappler, good takedown game, and kind of super grindy top position wrestling attack where he's not a lay and pray guy. He's constantly chipping away with strikes, constantly trying to advance position, but just very buttoned down while he does it. His opponents have very few chances. They almost never see daylight. There's no chance to, slip out, the side. There's no chance to get a butterfly hook in and kick him off. Like, he's just very, very, like, conservative sounds like an insult, but I don't mean it that way. He's just methodical is a better word than conservative.
He's like Glover.
Thank you. Yes, he is like Glover in that he is a methodical top position grappler that probably feels about 100 pounds heavier than he really is if he's on you. And it was all that way right up until he ran into Damon Jackson, and that should have been the most favorable possible matchup for him, because Jackson is also a wrestler and, good grappler who's not as athletic, and I would have thought would have the striking disadvantage. And all of a sudden Damon Jackson goes full, like,
for something else.
Machida. Well, yeah, his brother died.
Yeah.
His brother died. And normally I don't place too much stock in that. Like, dude, how many people show up on the Contender Series and they're like, I'm fighting for my daughter, her mom died, or I'm fighting my dad died, or this is my buddy's dog tags, and they get crushed because, as Corey Sandhagen said after beating Marlon Vera, he's like, eventually you're going to run into a guy who's just as hungry and is a better fighter than you. So most of the time, I don't think the intangibles make the difference, but whatever it was that made Damon Jackson practice the crane technique, like I'm picturing him at Fortis just standing on a dock piling like Daniel LaRusso, like, Damon Jackson came up with the perfect moment at the perfect time, and I couldn't be happier for him. But from the Pat Sabatini perspective, I'm inclined to think of that as an outlier. He, like Frank Mir, Ian Freeman, you ran into the wrong dude on the wrong night. But if Pat Sabatini gets back to Pat Sabatini business, I do favor him against Almeida here. Mostly because, Almeida looked great against Mike Trizano. Like chewed him up on the feet, cut him.
Vicious.
Yeah, vicious. Like gave him like a nasty cut. And that, Trizano already suffers from lack of focus sometimes in fights. And that kind of distraction, I'm sure, like there was no coming back from that. And it started to go downhill really quick from there. But aside from that, the problem with Almeida is he's
probably just going to get out grappled.
He's going to get out grappled and he's going to get tired first too. So there's not even a hang out there. And is Sabatini going to blunder into a triangle after like 13 minutes of top position grappling? Probably not. Is when the third round starts and Sabatini has made avocado toast out of the canvas and Almeida for 2 rounds, is Sabatini suddenly going to walk into another front kick for the second fight in a row? I don't think so. Like for Almeida to win, Sabatini would have to make a huge mistake. And he really hasn't done that. So this feels pretty straightforward to me. Sabatini by decision, and it's a fight where it won't be the most compelling viewing, and Almeida will be super, super frustrated by the end, but we'll have no one to blame but himself. Sabatini's strengths just play well into his weaknesses.
The one thing I noticed about Sabatini is that camp has a lot of uncomfortable, nervous energy strikers. Kind of like all of them. Like Sean Brady is like that a little bit. Jeremiah Wells is definitely like that. And I think Sabatini also is kind of like that too, where you can tell he's pretty reactionary to strikes. If Almeida has an advantage in this fight, it's on the feet. If they strike, Almeida is going to chew him up. Like Almeida is a vicious striker. He's, very nuts and bolts in his ways where he's just, straightforward. Everything he does is pretty clean, somewhat defensively sound on the feet. And he just has good power with everything he does. But I do think Sabatini can just get in and out wrestle him and out grapple him. And he can just nullify that, that striking difference. You can be the best striker in the world, but, if your wrestling is a 3.5 out of 10 and your defensive wrestling is a 3.5 out of 10 and your opponent's at a 6.5, you're going to lose that fight. Even if your opponent's at a 3 striking level, you're just going to lose.
If your opponent is smart enough to wrestle, which Sabatini is.
Exactly. Especially getting iced the way he got iced, that's only going to make him press his grappling even more. But that also could make him react more to shots. But I do think he'll probably come out and put a wrestling game on him, out grapple him. He's very heavy on top. He might even play it safe. But Almeida is a dog. If this turns into a way where Almeida hurts him on the feet, I could see it rolling downhill for him pretty quick too. But you got to go Sabatini, I think. Probably a decision.
Third from the top on the UFC Vegas 75 main card is a middleweight matchup between Armen Petrosyan and Christian Leroy Duncan. Petrosyan, the 32-year-old Armenian, is 8-2 overall. He's 2-1 since joining the UFC out of the 2021 season of Dana White's Contender Series. He is coming off a win, took a unanimous decision over AJ Dobson back at UFC 280 last October. That allowed him to bounce back from his decision loss to Caio Borralho last July. He'll look to make it 2 in a row against Duncan, who will look to make it 9 in a row. The 27-year-old Brit is a perfect 8-0 as a professional mixed martial artist. He's 1-0 since joining the UFC as the outgoing Cage Warriors middleweight champ. Debuted in March at UFC 286, winning. I mean, he finished Dusko Todorovic in like 2 minutes. It goes down as a knee injury, and Todorovic's knee was in fact injured, but there are still some takeaways from that fight that we'll get to in a moment. But yeah, nonetheless, 8-0, looking to go 9-0, and continue to certify himself an exciting prospect in that division. The odds favor him to get it done. He's minus 175, Petrosian plus 140. I keep on underestimating Petrosian. I wasn't that high on him coming into the Contender Series. I thought his record was a little inflated. He was a little old to be a prospect. I mean, he was 30 already. And so even with, some kickboxing in his background, I was thinking he has a lot to make up here. And especially on the regional scene, even as he's destroying overmatched guys, his ground game was an obvious glaring weakness. The interesting thing is that he's really kind of sealed that up. On the Contender Series, he knocked out Kaloya and Kolev. I don't remember what the line was there, but Kolev was a hot prospect. He was 12-0 coming into that fight, and he's gone 2 or 3-0 since then. I mean, he still hasn't lost another fight except for getting knocked out by Petrosian. And I mean, it's really comical that after losing his Fight Nights Global belt, he took a one-off fight in Coliseum MMA where he knocked a dude out in 14 seconds. And he was so embarrassed by the win that he tried to hide the win. I mean, we get a lot of people at the, people that work on the Sherdog Fight Finder. We get plenty of fighters and their managers trying to erase losses, trying to hide early career losses. This is the first time Jay Petrie and I remember a fighter at like the UFC level trying to hide a win. So plenty to laugh at Petrosian about, but you know what? If your ground game is a glaring problem, you don't beat Gregory Rodriguez. And
oh no.
And I mean, he lost to Caio Borralho, but you know what? Caio Borralho is probably going to fight for a title sometime in the next 12 months. And he is a super elite ground fighter. And it wasn't, I mean, Borralho definitely beat him, but it wasn't a complete mopping of the floor.
And he had to wrestle.
Yeah. And he had to wrestle. So Petrosian, he's not quite the striker I thought he was coming up, though he's still good. And he's not quite the liability I thought he was on the ground coming up. Like he's turned surprisingly good. I mean, he might still have some upside at age 32. The problem is that he's running into someone in Christian Leroy Duncan that it's hard for fans, it's hard for media not to overhype this guy. Talking about kind of, undefeated prospects coming out of the UK or prospects on long winning streaks coming out of the UK. By all rights, this guy should be more hyped than people like Muhammad Mokaev. He had a lengthy amateur career. That's something that even North America has fallen behind Europe on, and specifically England.
Mm-hmm.
Like, good prospects get plenty of amateur fights, which means they can fight, like they can have like 10 amateur bouts in a year, with like shin guards on, and just get their rounds in against live opponents. And
that they're way overmatched on.
Yeah, that they're way overmatched on, or if they're not overmatched, at least, they're not getting like knocked unconscious. They just, it wasn't my night. I lost 3 3-minute rounds. I go back to the drawing board. It's not like I'm just stuck against a better fighter in a pro fight getting knocked out. And as a pro, he presents as a knockout artist if all you have to go on is his highlight reel, but he is well-rounded. He gets knockouts because he is explosive. He's blisteringly fast. He has a ton of power on everything, and it's kind of effortless power. He throws. I mean, I said this about Muslim Salikhov. He throws exotic strikes. I mean, he has wins by like, flying knees, spinning back elbow, spinning heel kick. Yeah, beautiful timing. But he throws those things having mastered the fundamentals, and usually he only starts throwing those things when he has the fight well in hand. Like Duncan is 8-0 because he hasn't left himself open to getting surprised by an inferior fighter. He's surprisingly mature for a 28-year-old prospect as well. The Dusko Todorovic fight was over in under 2 minutes. Todorovic went down with a knee injury, but you know what? If you pause that fight at 1 minute and 45 seconds, like before the knee goes out, I would have been very comfortable saying that Todorovic was getting knocked out that round. Like Duncan had been just so much faster. And we're talking about someone in Todorovic that is a young, mildly promising middleweight prospect himself who has good power and is a kickboxer by inclination. And Duncan was beating him to everything and hitting him hard. Like Todorovic was marked up already and didn't have anything else to do but to kind of be on the gunnery range with Duncan. I mean, the knee injury happened. It was what it was, but it might only have, yeah, thank you. It might only have saved Todorovic from like an uglier and less excusable loss. Here, Duncan is going against Petrosian, who Petrosian can knock him out. Petrosian is at least as big. He himself is also fast, powerful, explosive.
He's really tough.
Yeah.
Petrosian really is super tough. Robocop had his nose folded in half.
Yes.
And I mean, his nose is broken halfway through the first round of that fight. And I mean, Robocop is known to be, deficient when it comes to his durability, but his offensive striking game, I mean, is just as venomous.
It is. I agree. So I'm saying Petrosian has all the weapons to hang with Duncan on the feet, even if I think Duncan has a slight advantage in, speed, power, probably they're both pretty defensively sound. But the best I can say about Petrosian is he has survived on the ground against some very good ground fighters, and his defensive wrestling is not as bad as I thought it was coming in to the Contender Series, whereas Duncan is a good offensive wrestler and grappler when he wants to be. So he has a safety valve that Petrosian doesn't. If Duncan decides to surprise Petrosian just to kind of give him something to think about when they're striking, he's going to be able to do it. If Petrosian does hurt him, Duncan will probably finish that desperation single instead of just hanging and getting hammer fisted. Because of that, I think this is a bad matchup for Petrosian. Petrosian is incredibly tough, so it's hard for me to pick him to get finished. I mean, just the way he hung on to beat Rodriguez, the way he hung on even in a losing effort against Caio Borralho, I'm going to accord Petrosian the respect of saying he makes it to the final bell here, but this will be just, I think, another step on Duncan's journey to wherever that ends up in the UFC middleweight division. But again, hard not to get too hype on this guy. I'm trying to tap the brakes a little bit, but this is a favorable matchup for him, I believe. So give me Duncan by a pretty one-sided decision here.
I kind of agree with everything you've got to say about it. Petrosian, Armin Petrosian, not to be confused with Armin Petrosian, because there's another Armin Petrosian that is like a world-renowned high-level kickboxer.
And it is so rare.
It's so weird, right?
No, it's so rare to have John Anik make a mistake on the air. But totally in one of probably Petrosian's UFC debut, Anik was talking about in Petrosian's UFC debut. He said he was talking about his brother Giorgio, and I'm like, he's not the Armin that has a brother Giorgio.
With over 100 kickboxing bouts.
Yeah, that's the other Armin Petrosian has a brother Giorgio. But just normally
their pictures are even mixed up. Like if you go online right now, their pictures are just like each of them have each other's pictures like on their profiles.
Armen Petrosyan is a pretty common name in Armenia. I'm surprised that
Quite literally, because we have two of them back to back.
Yeah.
Both from the same place.
Yep.
For UFC Petrosyan, MMA Petrosyan, I think he is a capable kickboxer, which is also his background, which is just makes it even more freaking, like, it's not like he's a grappler, like he's got a kickboxing background. He's super tough, though. Again, we already talked about that. He's super tough. He does have all the tools to have success in a fight like this, but Christian Leroy Duncan, the one thing middleweight is a division where there's just not a ton of like athletic fast dudes.
Nope.
Like there's Yoel Romero is not, he's over 40 and like he's an extremely quick, explosive athlete, but someone like Christian Leroy Duncan, like he's actually that guy. Like he's really fast. He's got a well put together game. Just like you said, he might be A&O in pro MMA, but if you go to SureDog.com, just go scroll through all of his low level amateur fights that he's got. God, how many? 20 something? Like he has tons of MMA experience. And I just think he's going to be faster than Petrosyan. I think there will be moments of success where Petrosyan does have success on the feet. But I just see Christian Leroy Duncan having just the speed advantage. If he can get in and out and just do ones and twos, he can. I don't want to say he can cruise because Petrosyan is dangerous. He can't cruise against a guy like that. But if he's landing 3 to every Petrosyan's 1 and it goes that way for 3 rounds, I could totally see him just winning a decision here.
That brings us to the co-main event of UFC on ESPN 47. It is a lightweight matchup between Arman Tsarukyan and Joaquim Silva. Tsarukyan, the 26-year-old Armenian by way of Russia, is 19-3 overall. He is 6-2 in the UFC. He's coming off a win. Last fought on the Cannonier versus Strickland card back in December, where he took a unanimous decision off of Damir Ismagulov. Prior to that, he had dropped a very, very close decision to Mateusz Gamrot last June, which some people thought he won. Like I'm sure we'll get into that. He, regardless of how you feel about that, it's looking to keep the good vibes going here against Silva. The 34-year-old Brazilian is 12-3 overall. He is 5-3 in the UFC. He's coming off a win. He fought most recently on the UFC Fight Night Dern versus Jan back in October, where he knocked out Jesse Ronson in the second round. Odds, Tsarukyan is the biggest favorite on the card. He may be the biggest betting favorite in any UFC fight this year.
He's the biggest favorite on this card times like 3, actually.
Almost 4. Well, he may end up being the biggest favorite on any UFC card all year. He is minus 1,000. Silva plus 600 on the comeback. Here's the thing about Arman Tsarukyan. And I said something sort of parallel to this about Lucas Almeida, where Almeida is a huge featherweight and the UFC just kept mashing him with huger ones. Tsarukyan, the only thing you can pick at about him, his like spectacular skill set and physical tools, is that he is small for a lightweight. He's a 5'7", compactly built guy, and the UFC seems to be bent on drawing attention to that by matching him with the biggest lightweights it can find. Joel Alvarez is giant,
huge.
Damir Ismagulov is
huge.
Is the best 161-pound fighter in the world. Like Christos Zhalgas is like one of the small guys he's fought. But aside from Tsarukyan being just, short in stature for lightweight, he's got everything else. He is explosive. He is an explosive athlete. Like obviously the old saw about the UFC, if you have been watching since, the tough era, like since the mid-aughts, is that when Mike Goldberg couldn't think of anything else to say about a black fighter, he'd call them explosive and athletic. It's why it became kind of a running joke. And, Yeah, there have been plenty of legitimately explosive and athletic fighters in the UFC of every skin color. I mean, dude, Michael Chandler is explosive and athletic.
Oh,
George St. Pierre was explosive and athletic.
Habib
was explosive and athletic. It's the difference between Habib Nurmagomedov and Rustam Khabilov. They're like the same size and fight the same way, but one of them was an A athlete and the other wasn't. Sarukian is as fast twitch an athlete as there is in that division. He is, and because of that, he has good power on his strikes. I mean, he's not, for the most part, he's not a one-shot knockout artist, but I mean, he has knocked people out with head kicks, which is impressive, again, for a guy that's given up 4 or 5 inches in height to a lot of his opponents. He is a very, very good wrestler, offensively as well as defensively. And this is a good thing, considering that he's undersized, fighting in a division where there are a lot of good wrestlers. When he's the superior wrestler and isn't at a huge size disadvantage, he's a very good offensive wrestler. When he's fighting a great wrestler who's bigger than him, he at least doesn't concede the takedown easily. Like, you don't see, and it's kind of like
world-class scrambling. His scrambling is
exactly
great.
It's similar to another undersized guy in the weight class down from him, Movsar Evloev, where if you're big enough, you can get him off his feet, but his butt is going to touch the canvas, and then he's going to be hitting the switch. He's going to be like grabbing an overhook, scrambling back to his feet. He doesn't concede the takedown. Trying to take Arman Sarukian down is like trying to give a cat a bath.
Yeah. A stray cat.
Yeah. This feral thing. He is exhausting to fight, and he's 6-2 in the UFC. He has a loss to Mateusz Gamrot that I think it's almost dead even, that like people on MMA Decisions thought either he or Gamrot won it. And he has a loss to Islam Makhachev where he won a round. Like he for the longest time was the only guy that legit took a round off Islam Makhachev. He's the Gleison Tebow of Islam Makhachev, where, you know, in talking about Khabib's incredible dominant rise up the UFC rankings, that always kind of gloss over the Tebow fight that he probably should have lost. For the longest time, Makhachev on his way up, Sarukian was the only guy that even like slowed him down. And Sarukian is only 26. Yep. That's the other wild thing. He's 26, yet he has actually a ton of high level experience, and he hasn't taken monstrous beatings.
And he might not ever.
Which, I mean, on this card, we've talked about so many guys where, yeah, he's got great tools, but he's a little old to be this, you know, like only this far along in his MMA career. Sarukian's the opposite. He's only 26. He's got over 20 fights, and he's not taken massive beatings that have taken tread off the tires. All the upside in the world.
He reminds me of just like a little bit more put together Ilia Topuria. Like just a little bit cleaner everywhere.
A little cleaner everywhere, and
a little faster.
And has his weight cut dialed in.
Arman Sarukian is like almost as fast in the pocket for 3 rounds as Fiziev is in the first round. Mm-hmm. Like, he is a lightning bolt. He is literally a freaking spark plug. And if you look at the other person that had grappling success against Islam in the UFC, Volk, super similar body type, like super similar athletic abilities between the both of them. Arman, he is so good in the pocket. Like, mm-hmm. That's just like, he shines in the pocket. Look what he did to Zhalgas. And then even against wrestlers and grapplers that he's undersized, like look what he did to Joel Alvarez. Like, yep. It looks like he walked into a room to fight him with a machete after that fight was over. Like, yes. It was like, you ever seen a video of someone like husking a coconut with a machete?
Oh yeah.
That's what he did to his head.
I've husked a coconut with a machete. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what he did to Joel Alvarez. Like, Arman Sarukian is just good everywhere. Like, he's got for a dude that's 26, his game is put together like he's 32.
Yes, completely agree. And
it's going to kill Silva, dude.
Yeah, there are a couple of kind of thought processes that I use when I'm trying to analyze fights. Like, when we have a fight where one or both fighters, I don't think
Didn't even talk about Silva.
I'm about to talk about them. When we're talking about when I'm thinking about a fight where one or both of the fighters aren't UFC level, sometimes I'll start with, okay, what do they do at a UFC level? And a few times I've come out and said, okay, I don't think this fighter actually does anything at a UFC level, and they're going to be gone. And when we're dealing with a prohibitive favorite, like a 10-1 favorite in Sarukian, I'll ask, okay, if the underdog wins, what's it look like? What avenues to victory are there, and how plausible are they? Here's the problem with Joaquim Silva. And kudos to Tom Feely, the brilliant and underratedly funny writer of Sherdog's text previews, for pointing out this general principle to me, which I'll flesh out. Joaquim Silva's nickname is Neto BJJ. Neto it means it means grandson in Portuguese, but it's basically like the BJJ kid, idiomatically. You have to go back to 1998 Vitor Belfort to find another guy that wanted to be a BJJ fight like Representative Harder, while his entire game runs off chain gunning haymakers on overmatched fighters.
He hasn't won via submissions, dude. So this is one of the fights that I chose to break down in my personal show, and like my key point of this was his nickname is Neto BJJ, and he hasn't won a fight via submission since 2014.
Exactly.
It's like Vitor screaming jiu-jitsu after
it was
chopping someone's head off.
It was worse than that. It was Vitor running out and thrashing like John Hess in 12 seconds, and then Carlson Gracie carrying him out there on his shoulders, yelling jiu-jitsu. Like, dude, they gave Vitor his black belt after knocking somebody out with punches. Like, anyway.
That's what they did for Woodley. But I mean, he won via Darce.
Yeah. 25 years later, Joaquim Silva proudly follows in that tradition.
Just such a Brazilian thing to do, dude. It's so awesome.
It is. Here's what I'll give him. He does hit like a tank. And for 7 minutes or however long his chin because the problem is his gas tank outlasts his chin. Like, he is able to keep up a ridiculously torrid pace for longer than you would expect for such a tanked up, muscle bound lightweight who throws so hard and throws like so aggressively. His gas tank is better than you would expect, but his chin can't take the kind of firefights he wants to get into. Like, getting lamped by Nasrat Haqparast is not embarrassing. Haqparast hits really hard. Getting knocked out in 30 seconds by Ricky Glenn means you need to come up with a different approach if you want to stay in the UFC. Here, he is running. He's going to run forward, throwing haze at a fighter who, hasn't really been hit cleanly more than maybe 10 times in his entire UFC run, and hasn't been hurt badly by any of them. Silva's best route to victory is to catch Sarukian with a perfect overhand right. But even if he catches him with a perfect overhand right, I think Sarukian still wins that round.
Because he's going to have to overextend to even hurt him.
Yeah.
And then Sarukian, he's just like, he's kind of just got everything. Like, he doesn't have bad fight IQ.
Nope.
And he's just good everywhere. Like, he could outstrike him. He could really outstrike Silva if he wanted to, but I think he's just going to impose a topside grappling game on him. And I really think he's just going to make him tired and then elbow his head off.
I agree. Sarukian could win that firefight. It's worth noting that trying to run at and knock out at close range a guy whose primary sparring partner is Dustin Poirier is not a recipe for success, because Dustin Poirier is probably the scariest guy in that range in the UFC.
Pocket.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah, just his yeah. It's a bad look for Silva. Like I would be legitimately shocked if Silva had anything for Sarukian. I expect Sarukian will take Silva down probably within the first 60 seconds of this fight. I could see him like racking up a 10-8 round, just being on top, hurting him with elbows, constantly trying to advance position. If Silva doesn't like what he's getting and turns his back, maybe he gets choked out that round. I'm going to say he makes it to the second round, but just Sarukian, I'm going to say knocks him out in the second round on the ground after just 7 or 8 minutes of complete domination.
I think it's going to be the exact same way. I think he's going to take him down in the first round, something close to a 10-8, and then just make it happen again, but just completely seal the deal in the second round. I think it's going to look like the Joel Alvarez fight. Don't see why it doesn't. That's the path to victory. He's a smart kid. He knows he's a 10-1 favorite. This is a paycheck for him. The only reason why this fight's happening is because nobody will fight him. If he does win this fight in the way we think he's going to win it, like he's probably got to fight Beneil Dariush, or Fiziev.
Sure.
Like, those two dudes have come off a loss. Looking too far ahead, but that's why I think Arman's going to win. But man, someone fight this guy, please.
With that, we come to the main event of UFC Vegas 75, a high-level middleweight contenders match between Marvin Vettori and Jared Cannonier. Vettori, the 29-year-old from Northern Italy, is 19-6-1 overall. He is 9-4-1 in the UFC. He is a former middleweight title challenger, having come up short in his rematch with Adesanya back in almost exactly 2 years ago at UFC 263. He is coming off a win. He fought back at UFC 286 in March, took a unanimous decision over the previously red-hot Roman Dolidze. He will be facing Cannonier, the 39-year-old Alaskan, 16-6 overall, 9-6 in the UFC. Worth noting that he is 6-2 at middleweight. This is a guy that debuted in the UFC as a 240-pound heavyweight, made his way down through the divisions until he turned into a block of solid protein, and since dropping to 185, he's lost to the greatest 185-pounder of all time, Israel Adesanya, and probably the third greatest of all time, Robert Whittaker, and that's about it. He won his last time out. It was a split decision win over Sean Strickland in the headliner of UFC Fight Night 216 in December. If you are watching this on video as opposed to listening to an audio version, you see my co-host Dev here making the I don't know about that decision face. You could say the same about Vettori's win over Dolidze, however, which was literally a dead split on MMADecisions.com. So 2 men with something to prove.
Yeah.
Before you even break it down, let me get the odds out here. It's close to a pick'em, but Cannonier is the slightest of favorites. He's -115, Vettori -105. Neither of them available at even money at any reputable place in North America, so I'm calling it a pick'em.
It's funny, when I did my write-ups like 4 hours ago, they were both at -110.
Yeah, no, I mean, and they're both at -110 at some outlets too. They've been drifting back and forth, but I couldn't find either guy at plus money anywhere respectable. So
this is actually like a pretty good fight to put on. Both of them are coming off of iffy wins where they did prove that they still are at the top of the division. I think Marvin Vettori was closer to winning his fight over Dolidze than Cannonier was closer to winning his fight over Strickland, if that makes any sense. I scored Vettori's fight for Vettori, and then I scored, the other Jared and Sean, I scored that for Strickland. And based more off of Jared Cannonier hits pretty hard, but Sean Strickland didn't seem to be buzzed by much of that. And I think it was just like louder, one of those types of things. Vettori is a guy that I've said this quite a few times tonight, but he is a nuts and bolts MMA dude. Like, he just does everything well. He's not better at anything. You know, his wrestling game is just as good as his grappling game. Everything kind of ties together. And he's been at this for a long time, even though he's still a pretty young dude. And he's kind of grown up in the UFC. He may be a champ if Israel Adesanya wasn't around. And kind of the same goes for Cannonier. Vettori actually has shown improvements in his game, though. Like, we've never seen him really fight off the back foot the way he did against Dolidze. That was pretty impressive, actually. That's like a new wrinkle to the Marvin Vettori game. He used to be just a pretty aggressive pressure guy, swarming, not tons of power, swinging clang. But Dolidze forced him to take the back foot, and he showed good counterpunching in that fight. I was really impressed by that. Cannonier, on the other hand, he's known for having big power. He's a guy that more people should talk about when it comes to like most chiseled up, bricked up dudes in the UFC. Like, he's just, and it's not that he's big. He's not one of those like short fire hydrant dudes, like super long arms. He's just like he's like a fitness magazine looking dude.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't know if it's crystals. I don't know what it is, but he's just enormous. And his body transition from heavyweight down to middleweight has been kind of just like incredible thing to see, especially at the end of his career, like being old. He's 39. It is middleweight, so you can kind of almost get away with it because middleweight is basically just a little heavyweight. But in the beginning, when I was looking at this fight, I immediately favored Cannonier. Right away, I told myself, Cannonier, he hits harder, he has more leg kicks. He's probably, neither one of them are fast. You know, Jared Cannonier had a lot of success against Israel Adesanya against the cage. He was able to hold Izzy up, and Izzy's known to be a dude that actually has a game that negates anything off the back of that cage. Against everyone else, Izzy doesn't. You don't tangle with Izzy on the cage. He usually has the ability to avoid that. Against Cannonier was able to get the underhooks and really kind of bully Israel around. And there was ways he could beat Israel in a fight. And he's kind of, you know, outside of Pereira, he's one of the only guys that have like, and maybe Yoel, really showed that he's got something that he could maybe work with. His problem is he also gets hurt like in every fight. Even the fights that he wins, he gets hurt. He is very tough, but I just don't know what his durability is like. Vettori, on the other hand, Vettori is an absolute tank. Like, I believe that's a guy you could probably hit in the head with a hammer, and he would say, okay, cool. Like, he just doesn't get fazed by big shots. I would say Dolidze probably hits just as hard as Cannonier. Dolidze is a beast. He's huge, too. And he stayed in the pocket. He was able to counter Dolidze, and Dolidze was spamming bombs on Vettori. Another fight you have to look at is the Pauga Costa fight. Costa was huge against Vettori.
Well, yes, he sure was.
Like at 205. And Vettori literally looked like a 185er fighting a 205er in that fight. And Costa is probably just as powerful and as venomous of a striker as Cannonier. The only difference is their kicking game. I would say Costa has more of a body kicking game where he relies more on body kicks, and Cannonier will really eat your legs up. But Vettori was just able to hang tough, get in the pocket, land his shots. I think Cannonier is probably not as durable as Costa either. Like, Costa couldn't have Jared Cannonier couldn't have the war Yoel Romero and Costa had. He would have gotten knocked out. I kind of like Marvin Vettori as a slight underdog maybe in this fight. Jared Cannonier's 39, and I just haven't seen like true improvements in his game where I watched Vettori counterpunch. He had his back foot against the cage 70% of his fight with Dolidze, and he was the one landing the better shots. He was the one rolling with things. He's the one that stayed tighter in the pocket. You're not going to scare Vettori. Like, you can hit him hard, and you're not going to scare him. And I just think his combination boxing is going to be better than Cannonier. He also kicks the body. Cannonier at 39, I know he's going to be more powerful than Vettori, but I think that's really the only thing he has. I think Vettori has more of like a nifty game where he just has a little bit more he can rely on.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with your overall breakdown of their skills and their respective arcs, during their UFC run. I would say the last noticeable improvement I saw out of Cannonier was against Brunson a year and a half ago, where all of a sudden his defensive wrestling was better and his get-up game was much better.
Sure.
Like, no, because
he didn't freak out.
Yeah. Yes. One, he didn't panic. Two, normally, I mean, Derek Brunson had his flaws as a fighter, but once he got you down and settled in top position, I mean, it was time for him to go to work. And Cannonier, I mean, he almost did like Derek Lewis get up against him, where just like shoved him off and got back up because he was pissed. Like,
yeah,
but
he's just so strong too. But
he is, even though Brunson, I mean, I saw that fight in person. I was around those guys all fight week. Brunson looked way bigger. And I mean, he probably was 10 pounds heavier once they got into the cage, but Cannonier
stronger, probably.
Incredibly strong, and maintains just a certain amount of explosion in his core and in his limbs as he pushes 40. But that's an improvement that wasn't going to help him much against Adesanya, wasn't going to help him much against Strickland, since Strickland has decided not to wrestle anymore. And it could help him against Vettori, because Vettori is a surprisingly good offensive wrestler and has shown himself willing to use it when it's the best move. But
he's not going to hurt him in that same way.
Exactly. And
Vettori doesn't blow it like Brunson. Like, I also think part of that was Brunson just blowing it. Like Brunson just blows it in a lot of fights.
And something weird happened. Like, his fuel gauge just suddenly hit empty early in the second round, and it was all over. It was weird. But at any rate, Vettori is probably still improving. He's still not even 30 years old. And ironically, considering that the reason that he's already the greatest Italian fighter of all time is because he relocated to the US so early on and got a King's MMA. Like,
it's a good camp.
It's a great camp. And it's just ironic that the guy who is most famous, or at least originally famous for shoot a box, all of a sudden is doing stuff like making Vettori better at fighting off his back foot. Here, Cannonier is probably going to catch Vettori with some things clean, but Vettori's going to shrug him off. And when Vettori hits Cannonier back, it's going to show on Cannonier, even if he doesn't flatline him.
It's going to be like the Hernandez fight. That's what I really think about.
There you go. Where even before the actual TKO came, they hit each other, but you could tell the difference in power and the difference in recoverability from the way each of them reacted. I'm not saying that Cannonier goes full, 40-year-old Chuck Liddell and just gets slept by the first clean shot that hits him, but I do think it's going to hurt him, make him recover, get him out of the game plan of what he wants to do offensively, and maybe even leave him a little discouraged by the end of the fight, because above all else, Vettori is a guy that does not go away. Give me Vettori to win a decision here, probably win like a 49-46 or even 50-45 thing, where Cannonier maybe takes one of the first two rounds and they're both really close, but Vettori just pulls further ahead as they go because he has a better gas tank, younger, better recoverability. Vettori in a pretty comfortable decision here.
The thing about Vettori that he can really rely on, and something that I wish he also leaned on more, is, I mean, he already leans on his durability, but he has good volume when he wants to, and I think he should just up it. Like, he should just form his game, and because he's better than these two guys, but like, I wish he leaned on a game like Fluffy Hernandez or like Marc-Andre Barriol, where he's just like, they just push it and they just really rely on pushing it. If Vettori goes out there and really just puts his foot on the gas and just really lets his hands go and just ups his volume, like, he could be a problem. Like, that's going to work on a lot of people besides Izzy.
Mm-hmm.
And durability wise, like Robert Whitaker's great, but he's also like kind of flaky durability wise as of late. And Cannonier did hurt him, but like you're not gonna hurt Vettori in the last minute of the third round of a fight.
No,
like it just doesn't happen. Izzy couldn't hurt him.
Nope.
Like who's gonna Pereira could probably hurt Vettori.
Well, yeah,
but like that's the only dude. I just don't know who else. You know, like the dude, the body shots he took from Paulo Costa were freaking sickening, and he just walked through them.
He's too angry to get hurt.
It's the weirdest thing. Like he's too.
We're talking about a guy that has an official UFC publicity photo where he has his pants on backwards. And you can tell by the look on his face that somebody in that room tried to tell him, and he just got mad and refused to believe them. Like, Marvin Vettori is the angriest man in Europe. Like, he's too mad to get knocked out.
Remember when he tried to fight Carl Roberson in like the hotel?
Yeah.
Like, well, another thing too is he also does a lot of cross training with Sean Strickland and that team over there, which is just like a good team to be getting in sparring rounds with, you know.
Well,
like
especially considering that Strickland just fought Cannonier, yeah,
and beat him. However you want to see it.
Yeah.
Vettori for me, man, I think he does it by decision, and I kind of agree with you. Maybe Cannonier can squeeze out 2 rounds, but I think the rounds that Vettori wins are going to be more clear.
Yeah. All right. That is it. That has been the Sherdog Radio Network preview for UFC on ESPN 47. Vettori versus Cannonier. I've been your host, Ben. He has been your able, willing, and much appreciated substitute co-host, Dev. If this is your first time watching one of our shows or listening to one of our previews, first of all, thank you. We hope you enjoyed it. We do our best to bring as in-depth an analysis as you'll find anywhere in this industry, and do come back sometime for my usual co-host, Keith, which is pretty similar, but with a lot more Bo Nickel and 80s pro wrestling talk. Please do like, subscribe, leave us a comment. Keith and I are both good at answering those comments. We love to hear your takes on these fights. I at least picked one pretty big upset, so get at me. Well, we both picked the big upset, so get at us if you think we're out of our minds. But most importantly, join us for the recap. Should be Keith back in the captain's chair about 15 minutes after the main event of UFC Vegas 75. We're live on the Sherdog YouTube page, where we will talk about all 14 of these fights in reverse order, starting from the headliner all the way down to the first fight. We'll talk about what was good, what was bad, what was surprising, what was controversial. There's always something. And what's next for some of the notable winners as well as losers. And the live chat is open that whole time on the YouTube page. So we are taking your questions, your comments, and your hot takes in real time. We have a growing group of friends there that hang out with us after the fights. Deb is one of them. And we'd love to have you join us. Between now and then, thank you once again for listening. Enjoy the rest of your week, and by all means, enjoy the fights.